Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Warren LeClaire had earned his nickname Dusty the hard way, spending the better part of 32 years hauling freight across the American Southwest, where the desert dust had a way of working itself into every crease of a man's skin, every fold of his clothing, until it became as much a part of him as his own shadow. At 57 years old, he'd seen just about everything the long road had to offer, or so he believed until the night of October 14, 2019, when he pulled his aging Kenworth into the Devil's Throat rest stop along Highway 50 in central Nevada, roughly 40 miles east of the town of Eureka. The rest stop had earned its ominous name from the geological formation it sat beside, a massive depression in the earth that locals claimed had no bottom, though geological surveys had long since disproven that particular myth. Still, the name persisted, as did the unsettling reputation that kept most travelers moving past it toward more welcoming facilities further down the road. Dusty had stopped there dozens of times over the years without incident, finding it convenient precisely because of its unpopularity. Fewer trucks meant more space, more quiet, and on nights when sleep came hard, the absence of idling diesel engines made all the difference. The October night was unseasonably cold for the Nevada desert, with temperatures that had dropped into the low 40s as the sun disappeared behind the distant mountains. Dusty's cargo, a load of restaurant equipment bound for a casino renovation project in Reno, wasn't particularly valuable or time-sensitive, which meant he could afford to rest when his body demanded it, rather than pushing through on caffeine and determination, as he'd done too often in his younger years. His logbook showed he'd been driving for just under 9 hours, well within legal limits, but his lower back had been sending him urgent messages for the last 50 miles that it was time to stop, stretch, and maybe catch 4 hours of sleep before continuing on. The rest stop appeared in his headlights exactly as he remembered it. A crescent-shaped parking area carved into the rocky landscape with space for perhaps a dozen vehicles, though tonight only a single car occupied the far end near the restroom facilities. The building itself was a squat, concrete structure that had been built sometime in the 70s, showing its age in the faded paint and weathered surfaces that spoke of decades of harsh desert conditions. Fluorescent lights mounted above the restroom doors cast sickly pools of yellow-green illumination that did little to push back the encompassing darkness of the surrounding desert. Dusty maneuvered his rig into a spot near the center of the lot, positioning the truck so his driver's side window faced away from the single overhead light, a habit developed over years of learning to grab sleep wherever and whenever possible. He went through his shutdown routine with the practiced efficiency of long experience, checking his mirrors, setting the air brakes, making a final notation in his logbook. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m. If he could get 4 solid hours, he'd be back on the road by 4 in the morning, reaching Reno well before the morning rush made navigating the casino district a headache. Before settling in for the night, Dusty climbed down from the cab to make a restroom run and stretch his legs. The cold hit him immediately, a dry desert cold that seemed to leach warmth directly from his bones. He pulled his denim jacket tighter and headed toward the restroom building, his boots crunching on the gravel surface of the parking area. The car he'd noticed earlier, an older model sedan with California plates, sat silent and dark. No movement came from inside, and Dusty assumed the occupants were likely asleep, just another traveler catching rest on the long desert crossing. The restroom was as unpleasant as he'd expected, all cracked tile and flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed with a persistent electrical hum. Someone had made a half-hearted attempt at maintenance recently, evidenced by the industrial cleaner smell that fought a losing battle against decades of accumulated grime. Dusty finished his business quickly, washed his hands in water that ran rust-colored for several seconds before clearing, and headed back out into the cold Nevada night. That's when he noticed the gas station, not the rest stop itself, but an actual service station that he could have sworn hadn't been there when he'd pulled in 15 minutes earlier. It sat perhaps 200 yards beyond the rest stop, just barely visible in the darkness. Its outline suggested more than clearly seen. A single light burned above what appeared to be old-style pumps, the kind with the round glass tops that hadn't been in common use since the 1960s. The faint glow had an odd quality to it. Neither the bright white of modern LED lighting, nor the warm yellow of incandescent bulbs, but something in between that seemed to pulse ever so slightly, like a heartbeat rendered in light. Dusty stopped walking, one hand on the door handle of his truck, and stared at the distant structure. He'd driven this route 4 or 5 times a year for the better part of 3 decades. He knew every truck stop, every rest area, every gas station along Highway 50 between Salt Lake City and Reno. There was no service station at Devil's Throat. The nearest fuel was back in Eureka, 40 miles west, or Austin, 30 miles east. Yet there it stood, or appeared to stand, radiating that strange, pulsing light into the desert darkness. He climbed into his cab and retrieved the road atlas he still kept despite the GPS unit mounted on his dashboard, a habit from the pre-digital days that he'd never quite abandoned. He traced Highway 50 with his finger, confirming what he already knew. No service station marked at this location. He switched on his GPS and zoomed in on his current position. The device showed the rest stop clearly enough, but nothing else. No gas station, no structure of any kind beyond the restroom building. Dusty looked back out his window toward the distant light. It was still there, definitely still there. No question about its existence, even if the maps denied it. Perhaps it was a new establishment that hadn't made it into the databases yet, though that seemed unlikely given how slowly things changed out here in the empty heart of Nevada. Or maybe it was an old station, long abandoned and somehow missed by the cartographers, with a single stubborn light still drawing power from some forgotten connection. The reasonable thing would be to ignore it, to settle into his sleeper berth and get the rest his body was demanding. Tomorrow, in daylight, he could satisfy his curiosity if it still nagged at him. But something about that pulsing light bothered him in a way he couldn't quite articulate, a sense of wrongness that went beyond simple confusion about its presence. It reminded him of stories he'd heard over the years from other drivers, tales traded during long nights at truck stops about strange lights in the desert, about travelers who'd followed something that shouldn't have been there and found themselves someplace they couldn't explain. He was still deciding what to do when he noticed movement near the distant gas station. A figure had emerged from the structure, or perhaps had been standing there all along, and he'd only just registered its presence. Even at this distance, Dusty could tell it was a man, tall and thin, standing perfectly still beneath that odd light. The figure appeared to be looking in his direction, though the darkness and distance made it impossible to be certain. Dusty felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October cold. Something about that motionless silhouette triggered a primal unease, the same instinct that had kept him safe through 3 decades of long-haul trucking by warning him when situations weren't quite right. He'd learned to trust that instinct, had avoided more than one potentially dangerous situation by listening to the small voice that said something was wrong, even when he couldn't identify what specifically troubled him. The figure at the gas station raised one arm in what might have been a wave or a beckoning gesture. Dusty didn't wave back. Instead, he started his engine, the diesel rumbling to life with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the desert stillness. He wasn't sure what he planned to do, whether to investigate more closely or simply leave, but keeping the truck ready to move felt like the smart choice. As his headlights swept across the parking area while he repositioned slightly, They illuminated the sedan that had been parked near the restrooms. What he saw made his decision for him. The car sat exactly as it had before, dark and seemingly empty, but now he could see that all four of its tires were completely flat, the vehicle resting on its rims. More disturbing was the thick layer of dust covering every surface, dust that in the harsh desert environment would take weeks or months to accumulate. This wasn't a traveler resting for the night. This was an abandoned vehicle that had been sitting here for a very long time. Dusty's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he processed this new information. He'd walked right past that car less than 20 minutes ago. It had looked fine then, or at least he thought it had, though he had to admit he hadn't examined it closely. Had the flat tires and dust been there all along and he'd simply failed to notice in the darkness? Or had something changed in those few minutes while he'd been in the restroom? He looked back toward the distant gas station and the figure standing beneath its light. The man, if it was a man, hadn't moved. Still stood in the same position, arm still raised in that ambiguous gesture that could have been greeting or summons. The light above him continued its subtle pulsing, and now that Dusty was paying closer attention, he thought he could detect a rhythm to it, like Morse code perhaps, though he'd never learned to read the patterns. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to leave. Start driving and not stop until he reached Austin or beyond. Put distance between himself and this place that had suddenly revealed itself to be something other than the familiar rest stop he'd known for years. But Dusty had spent his entire life making the smart, safe choices, and where had it gotten him? Alone at 57, divorced twice, estranged from his only daughter, with nothing to show for 3 decades on the road except a paid-off truck and a small house in Elko that he visited perhaps 2 months out of the year. He put the transmission in gear but didn't immediately start moving. Instead, he found himself rolling slowly forward, not toward the exit that would take him back to Highway 50, but toward the mysterious gas station and its motionless attendant. Even as he did so, a part of his mind screamed at him to stop, to turn around, to run. But that voice was drowned out by something else, a curiosity mixed with something darker, a desire to finally see something that couldn't be explained, to have an experience that would give him a story to tell that went beyond weather delays and mechanical breakdowns. As he drew closer to the gas station, details began to emerge from the darkness. The building itself was small, probably no more than 12 feet square, constructed of weathered wood that might once have been painted white, but had long since faded to a silvery gray. The pumps, as he'd guessed from the distance, were indeed vintage models from the 50s or 60s, their glass tops intact but dark, no fuel visible in the cylinders. A hand-painted sign above the structure's single window read, "Earls," in letters that had been carefully formed but were now nearly invisible, worn by decades of desert sun and wind. The man beneath the light hadn't moved as Dusty approached, maintaining his statue-like posture with an unnatural stillness. As the truck's headlights swept across him, Dusty got his first clear look at the attendant. He was indeed tall, probably 6'3" or 4, and thin to the point of gauntness, his coveralls hanging loose on a frame that seemed to be all angles and sharp edges. His face was hidden in shadow beneath the brim of a cap that might have borne the logo of an oil company, though the embroidery was too faded to read. Dusty brought his truck to a stop about 30 feet from the pumps, leaving the engine running and his headlights on, illuminating the scene before him. The attendant finally moved, lowering his arm and taking a single step forward. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the closed windows of the truck's cab, despite the rumble of the diesel engine, which should have made that impossible. "Evening, driver. Didn't expect to see anyone tonight. Most folks pass right on by these days." The voice had a quality that Dusty couldn't quite place. Neither young nor old, neither friendly nor threatening, just flat and emotionless as the desert floor itself. Dusty cracked his window an inch, just enough to speak through. "Didn't know this place was here. Not on any of my maps." "Been here a long time," the attendant replied, still standing in that same spot, making no move to approach the truck. "Longer than most folks remember. Longer than the highway itself, truth be told." "You're Earl?" Dusty asked, though he wasn't sure why it mattered. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if considering the question. "Earl Granger. Opened this station back in '53. Pumped a lot of gas over the years. Not so much anymore, as you might imagine." Dusty's mind worked through the arithmetic. If this man had opened a gas station in 1953, he'd have to be in his 80s at least, probably 90s. But the figure standing before him, though gaunt, moved with none of the stiffness of advanced age. Moreover, the whole conversation was absurd. This station couldn't have opened in '53 because it didn't exist, at least not according to every map and GPS device that covered this stretch of Highway 50. "You looking for fuel?" Earl asked, taking another step forward. "Can't pump regular no more, but I keep a reserve of diesel. Never know when a trucker might need it." "Tank's 3/4 full," Dusty replied, which was true. "But I appreciate the offer." Earl nodded slowly. Most folks who stop here aren't looking for fuel. They're looking for something else. Or maybe something's looking for them. Hard to say which sometimes. The cryptic statement hung in the cold air between them. Dusty felt his unease deepening, that instinct that had served him so well over the years now screaming at him to leave, to put this place in his rearview mirror and never think about it again. But he found himself asking the question anyway. "What do you mean by that?" Earl's posture shifted slightly, and though Dusty couldn't see his face clearly beneath the cap's brim, he had the distinct impression the man was smiling. "This here's a thin place, driver. You know what that means? A thin place where the here and the there get mixed up, where what was and what is don't stay separate like they're supposed to. The desert's full of thin places, but this spot right here, this might be the thinnest of them all." Dusty had heard plenty of desert mysticism over the years, usually from sunstroked tourists or meth-addled drifters convinced the empty landscape held some profound spiritual significance. But something about the matter-of-fact way Earl delivered his explanation made it seem less like mysticism and more like a simple statement of observable fact. "If you're trying to scare me, it's working," Dusty said, attempting to inject some lightness into his voice and failing. "Not trying to scare you, just stating what is. You felt it, didn't you? That's why you came over here instead of staying put or moving on. You felt something calling, pulling at you. They do that sometimes, the thin places. They reach out to certain folks, draw them in. Question is, what do you plan to do now that you're here?" Dusty realized he didn't have an answer to that question. What did he plan to do? Certainly not conduct a normal transaction at this impossible gas station with its impossible attendant. Not investigate further, because every instinct told him that would be a catastrophically bad idea. Leave, then? Simply drive away and try to forget this entire encounter? Before he could formulate a response, Earl spoke again. "There was a woman came through here once. Long time ago now, though time's funny in thin places, so maybe it was yesterday or maybe it was 40 years back. Can't always tell. She was looking for something she'd lost, or maybe running from something she'd found. Stopped at that rest stop back there, same as you did. Only she saw the light here and came to investigate. Chatted with me for a bit, just like you're doing now. Then she drove off down that way." Earl pointed into the darkness beyond the gas station, where Dusty could now make out what appeared to be a dirt road leading deeper into the desert, away from the highway. "Said she saw something down that road. Something that looked familiar. Place she'd been before, maybe, or place she'd been looking for. drove right off into the desert and I never saw her come back. Did anyone ever find her? Dusty asked, though part of him knew the answer. Search parties came through eventually. Helicopters, dogs, the whole operation. Never found a trace. But sometimes, on nights like this, when the desert gets real quiet and the air gets real cold, I think I can hear her truck out there still, engine running, headlights cutting through the dark. Still looking for whatever it was she thought she saw, still trying to find her way back to the highway. The temperature inside the truck's cab seemed to drop several degrees despite the heater running at full blast. Dusty became acutely aware of the isolation of his position, miles from the nearest town, alone with this strange man at this impossible gas station that existed outside the bounds of every map and GPS system. The darkness beyond the feeble reach of his headlights seemed to press inward with almost physical weight. Her name was Lucinda Pike, Earl continued, his flat voice carrying that same impossible clarity. If you're the curious type, you can look her up. Disappeared somewhere along Highway 50 back in June of '79. They figured maybe she ran off the road in an area where the ravine was deep enough to hide a vehicle. But I know different. I saw her drive away from here, heading out into the places where the maps don't mean nothing, and the rules of here don't quite apply. Dusty did remember the name, vaguely. Lucinda Pike had become something of a legend among long-haul truckers, a cautionary tale about the dangers of Highway 50's lonely stretches. He'd heard the story years ago, probably at a truck stop somewhere, just another piece of road mythology that drivers collected and shared. "You're saying she's still out there?" Dusty asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying that in thin places, still doesn't mean what you think it means. Past and present get tangled up, and sometimes what's lost isn't quite gone. It's just displaced, existing in the cracks between one moment and the next. The desert keeps its secrets, but sometimes those secrets keep moving, keep searching, keep trying to find their way home, even though home might not exist anymore in any way that makes sense." Earl took another step forward, close enough now that Dusty could almost make out the features of his face beneath the cap's brim. Almost, but not quite, as if some quality of the strange light above them obscured as much as it revealed. "You should go now, driver. Back to the highway, back to your route, back to the world that makes sense. You've satisfied your curiosity. You've heard the warning. Don't make the mistake she made. Don't follow the lights that shine where no lights should be." Dusty didn't need to be told twice. He put the transmission in gear, executed a careful three-point turn in the cramped area around the gas station, and started back toward the rest stop and the highway beyond. In his mirror, he could see Earl Granger standing exactly where he'd been, arm raised again in that ambiguous gesture, backlit by the pulsing light above the impossible gas station. As he drove away, Dusty noticed something that made his blood run cold. The abandoned sedan near the rest stop was gone. Not moved, not towed, simply absent, as if it had never been there at all. The parking area was empty except for his own truck's tire marks in the dust, and those seemed to fade even as he watched, erased by wind or time or something else he couldn't name. He reached Highway 50 and turned east toward Austin, pushing the accelerator harder than he normally would, putting distance between himself and Devil's Throat rest stop as quickly as his loaded truck could manage. It was only after he'd driven 15 or 20 miles that he thought to check his rearview mirror one last time. The gas station was gone. No light pulsed in the darkness behind him. The desert stretched away under a cold October sky, empty and unremarkable. But Dusty could have sworn, just for a moment before he turned his eyes back to the road ahead, that he saw another set of headlights out there in the wasteland, cutting through the darkness parallel to the highway, neither approaching nor receding, just maintaining a steady course through terrain where no road existed. He drove through the night without stopping, reaching Reno by mid-morning, exhausted but alive. The story he could have told remained untold, locked away with all the other things he'd decided were better left unexamined. But sometimes, late at night when sleep wouldn't come, he'd think about Earl Granger and his impossible gas station, about Lucinda Pike driving endlessly through a desert that existed between moments, and about the thin places where the rules that governed the normal world frayed and tore, letting something else bleed through. And he never stopped at Devil's Throat rest stop again. Warren Dusty LeClaire tried to put that October night behind him. He finished his delivery in Reno, picked up a return load of casino furniture heading back to Salt Lake City, and took a different route that avoided Highway 50 entirely. The detour added 4 hours to his trip and burned extra fuel he couldn't really afford. But the alternative, driving past Devil's Throat rest stop again, was simply unthinkable. He told himself it was a one-time thing, a moment of fatigue-induced hallucination brought on by too many consecutive nights of inadequate sleep and poor truck stop food. The mind could play tricks when pushed hard enough, and after 32 years of long-haul trucking, Dusty knew his mind had been pushed plenty hard. But the explanation didn't quite fit. Hallucinations didn't leave tire tracks, and when he'd checked his truck's dashcam footage the next morning, it had recorded his approach to the gas station, the strange, pulsing light, even the vague silhouette of Earl Granger standing beneath it. The audio had captured their entire conversation with perfect clarity. Earl's flat, emotionless voice discussing thin places and lost travelers as casually as someone might discuss the weather. What the camera hadn't captured was the abandoned sedan with its flat tires and accumulated dust, or the gas station itself in any detail beyond that unsettling light. The footage showed Dusty's truck moving toward something, turning around, and leaving, but the something remained frustratingly indistinct, like trying to photograph a dream. 3 weeks passed before Dusty found himself with another westbound load that would naturally route through central Nevada. His dispatcher offered him the job on a Tuesday morning, a shipment of agricultural equipment parts heading to Fallon, and Dusty had accepted without thinking too hard about the route. It was only later, while planning his fuel stops and rest breaks, that he realized the most efficient path would take him right past that stretch of Highway 50 again. He could still refuse the load, or take the northern detour through Wells and Winnemucca, but doing so would require an explanation he didn't want to give. How could he tell his dispatcher that he was avoiding a specific rest stop because of an impossible gas station and a conversation with a man who might have been dead for decades? So he took the load, and on a cold November evening found himself approaching the section of highway where Devil's Throat rest stop waited in the darkness. He timed his drive specifically to pass through during daylight hours, figuring that whatever strangeness had manifested that October night would be less likely to appear under the harsh desert sun. But a combination of traffic delays in Salt Lake City and a longer-than-expected stop to chain up through a mountain pass had put him behind schedule. By the time he reached the long, empty stretch of Highway 50 east of Eureka, the sun had already dropped behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if they hadn't heralded the approaching darkness. Dusty considered pushing through without stopping, driving straight to Austin where he could fuel up and grab a proper meal at one of the truck stops there. But his logbook showed he was approaching his legal limit of driving hours, and the last thing he needed was to get pulled over for a logbook violation. The smart, safe choice was to stop at Devil's Throat, get his mandatory rest break, and continue on in a few hours when he'd have a fresh clock. It was just a rest stop, nothing more. Whatever he'd experienced 3 weeks ago had been a fluke, an anomaly, something that wouldn't repeat itself now that he knew to expect it. The rest stop appeared in his headlights at 7:23 p.m., looking exactly as mundane and unremarkable as he remembered it from dozens of previous stops over the years. The same crescent-shaped parking area, the same weathered concrete restroom building, the same flickering fluorescent lights that had probably been installed during the Carter administration and had never been properly maintained since. 2 other vehicles occupied the lot, a small RV parked near the restrooms, and a pickup truck with a camper shell at the far end. Normal travelers taking a normal break on a normal desert highway. Nothing strange, nothing unusual, nothing to trigger the anxiety that had been building in Dusty's chest for the last 50 miles. He pulled into a spot in the middle of the lot, positioning his truck with the same practiced efficiency as always, and went through his shutdown routine. The dashboard clock read 7:31 p.m. If he grabbed 6 hours of sleep, he could be back on the road by 1:30 a.m., reaching Fallon before sunrise. He made a notation in his logbook, checked his mirrors one final time, and prepared to climb into the sleeper berth. That's when he noticed the light. Not the fluorescent lights above the restroom building, but a different light. That same strange pulsing glow he'd seen 3 weeks ago, emanating from the darkness beyond the rest stop. The impossible gas station had returned, or perhaps had never left. Perhaps it had been there all along, waiting patiently for his return like a spider waiting for a fly to blunder back into its web. Dusty's first instinct was to start the engine and leave immediately, legal driving hours be damned. But something stopped him, a realization that running wouldn't solve anything. If this place, this thin place as Earl had called it, wanted his attention, it would keep finding ways to get it. Better to confront it now, in his own time and on his own terms, than to spend the rest of his life jumping at shadows and avoiding entire sections of highway. He grabbed his heavy flashlight from the door pocket, pulled on his denim jacket against the November cold, and climbed down from the cab. The temperature had dropped into the low 30s, cold enough that his breath fogged in the still desert air. The other vehicles in the lot remained dark and quiet, their occupants presumably asleep or at least settled in for the night. Dusty wondered briefly if they could see the gas station's light, or if this was something visible only to him, a private haunting tailored specifically to one aging trucker who'd made the mistake of paying attention. He walked toward the light with deliberate steps, not hurrying but not hesitating either. The distance seemed both shorter and longer than he remembered, the kind of spatial distortion that suggested he was moving through something other than ordinary space. The gas station resolved out of the darkness gradually, like a photograph developing, until he stood once again before the weathered structure with its vintage pumps and hand-painted sign. Earl Granger stood in his customary position beneath the light, as motionless as a mannequin, as if he'd been waiting there for the past 3 weeks without moving, without sleeping, without living in any way that would make sense to the ordinary world. "Evening, driver," Earl said in that same flat, effectless voice. "Didn't expect to see you again. Most folks who leave don't come back." "Didn't exactly plan on it," Dusty replied, stopping a safe distance from the attendant. "But here I am anyway. Thought maybe we should finish our conversation." Earl's head tilted slightly in what might have been acknowledgement or amusement. "Not much left to say. I warned you about the thin places. Warned you about following lights where no lights should be. You heeded the warning, drove away. Should have been the end of it." "Should have been," Dusty agreed. "Except I can't stop thinking about what you said. About Lucinda Pike, about her still being out there somewhere. About search parties never finding a trace. The past is a stubborn thing," Earl said. "Especially in places like this where it doesn't stay put the way it's supposed to. You're wondering if the story was true, if she really drove off into the desert looking for something that wasn't there. Or maybe you're wondering if I had something to do with it, if I'm some kind of threat you need to deal with." The directness of the statement caught Dusty off guard. He'd been thinking exactly that, turning over possibilities in his mind for 3 weeks, wondering if Earl Granger was a ghost or a demon, or just a crazy old man who'd somehow survived in this impossible place through means Dusty couldn't comprehend. "I looked her up," Dusty said. "Lucinda Pike. Found the newspaper articles from 1979. 34-year-old woman from Sacramento, disappeared while driving across Nevada. Her truck was never found. Search covered hundreds of square miles. Nothing." "And what did those articles tell you?" Earl asked. "That she was real. That her disappearance was real. That everything else you told me has at least some basis in documented fact." Dusty paused, gathering his thoughts. "They also said she'd made several strange phone calls before she vanished. Called her sister from a gas station payphone, said she'd seen something on the highway, something impossible. The sister thought she was having a breakdown, told her to find a motel and get some sleep. But Lucinda kept driving, made another call an hour later, more agitated. Said the thing she'd seen was following her, staying just out of sight but always there. That was the last anyone heard from her." Earl remained motionless, but something in his posture shifted slightly. "She stopped here that night. Saw the light just like you did. I told her the same things I told you. Warned her not to follow it. But the thing about thin places is they show you what you need to see, or what you fear to see, and sometimes there's no difference between the two. She saw something down that road, something that looked like home, or looked like escape, or looked like the answer to whatever question had been haunting her. And she drove toward it." "What was it?" Dusty asked. "What did she see?" "Can't say for certain. The thin places show different things to different people. Maybe it was her future or her past, or some sideways version of her present where things had gone differently. Maybe it was just a mirage, desert heat shimmer given form by her own desperate hoping. Whatever it wasn't real in the way you and I understand real. But it was real enough to her, real enough that she followed it right out of the world that makes sense and into the spaces between." Dusty looked past Earl toward the dirt road that disappeared into the darkness beyond the gas station. "Is she still out there? Really still driving around after all these years?" "Time doesn't work the same in the thin places," Earl said. "For her, it might still be June of 1979. That moment when she saw whatever it was she saw and made the choice to follow it. That moment might be stretched out, lasting forever, or cycling back on itself, or existing all at once in a way that would break your brain if you tried to understand it properly. But yes, in whatever way still means anything, she's still out there. And she's not alone." The last statement hung in the cold air between them. Dusty felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "What do you mean, not alone?" "You think she was the first?" Earl asked. "Or the last? This stretch of highway has been here since the 50s, but the thin place was here long before that. The Shoshone knew about it, avoided it, told stories about the spot where reality gets confused. Then white folks came through, building roads and gas stations, and some of them noticed the strangeness, and some of them didn't. Those who did, well, some of them made choices, followed lights, or voices or memories that seemed more real than the present, and the desert kept them, the way deserts keep everything eventually." "How many?" Dusty asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Earl turned his head slightly, and for the first time, Dusty caught a glimpse of his face beneath the cap's brim. What he saw made him take an involuntary step backward. The features were there, human features, but they had a quality that wasn't quite right, like a photograph that had been left in the sun too long and had faded in strange ways. The proportions slightly off, the details slightly wrong. "More than I can count?" Earl said. "Less than you'd think. The thin places are picky. They don't call to everyone. Just certain folks who have something in them that resonates with the frequency of the spaces between." People who are lost in some fundamental way, or looking for something they can't name, or running from something they can't outpace. People like Lucinda Pike. People like you, maybe. "I'm not lost," Dusty said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Everyone's lost," Earl replied. "Just most folks don't realize it until the thin places show them the truth. You're 57 years old, driving the same routes you've driven for 30 years, sleeping in your truck more nights than you sleep in your own bed, and for what? Where are you going that's so important you can't stop? What are you hauling that matters more than having a life that exists somewhere other than on these highways?" The questions hit harder than Dusty wanted to admit. He'd been asking himself variations of the same things for years now, especially after his second divorce, especially after his daughter had stopped returning his calls, especially during the long empty hours between one delivery and the next when there was nothing to do but drive and think and regret. "That's none of your business," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Maybe not," Earl agreed. "But the thin places make it their business. That's what they do. They find the cracks in people, the hollow spaces where something should be but isn't, and they whisper promises about filling those spaces. They show you the thing you've been looking for, even if you didn't know you were looking for it. And if you're vulnerable enough, lonely enough, desperate enough, you follow." "I'm not following anything," Dusty said. "I came here to get answers, not to be psychoanalyzed by a ghost, or whatever you are." "I'm not a ghost," Earl said. "Or at least, I wasn't always one. I really did open this gas station back in 1953. Did good business for a while, servicing travelers on Highway 50. Then one night I saw something I shouldn't have seen, and I followed it, and I ended up here. Or maybe I was always here, and the version of me that existed in the normal world was the illusion. Hard to say. Time gets tangled up in thin places. Cause and effect stop making sense. Maybe I'm the Earl Granger who died 50 years ago. Maybe I'm the Earl Granger who never existed at all. Maybe I'm just what happens when someone stays too long in a place where reality doesn't work right." Dusty absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with what he was seeing and hearing. "So you're trapped here, stuck in this place, warning travelers not to make the same mistake you did?" "Trapped, stuck, those words imply I want to leave," Earl said. "But where would I go? Back to a world where I've been dead for decades? Back to a life that ended before you were born?" "The thin places aren't prisons exactly. They're more like amber, preserving things that would otherwise be lost to time. I exist here, in this moment, and I'll exist here in the next moment, and the moment after that, for as long as the thin place holds together. Could be forever, could be until tomorrow. Time doesn't mean much when you're outside of time." A cold wind swept across the desert, carrying with it the smell of dust and something else. Something ancient and indefinable that made Dusty think of old bones and forgotten places. He pulled his jacket tighter and tried to organize his thoughts into questions that might yield useful answers. "Why are you telling me this? If you're trying to scare me away again, it's working. But if there's some other reason, some purpose to these conversations, I'd like to know what it is." Earl was silent for a long moment, and in that silence Dusty became aware of sounds he hadn't noticed before. The wind carried voices, or things that might have been voices, distant and distorted, calling out in languages he didn't recognize or in tones that weren't quite human. Beneath that he could hear engines, dozens or hundreds of engines, idling or revving or accelerating. The sound of vehicles moving through spaces where no roads existed. And underneath it all, a low, steady hum that might have been electronic or might have been organic. The sound of the thin place itself, breathing or thinking or simply existing. "I tell you because someone told me," Earl finally said. "Long time ago, when I was still new to this place, still trying to understand what had happened to me. There was an old Shoshone man, or something that wore the shape of an old Shoshone man, and he explained about the thin places. Said they'd been here since before the mountains, since before the desert, since before time itself had gotten organized enough to flow in one direction. Said they were scars in reality, places where the fabric of things had torn and never quite healed right. And he said that people who ended up in thin places had a responsibility to warn others, to try to prevent more souls from getting lost in the spaces between. But warnings don't always work, Dusty said, understanding. Lucinda Pike was warned, and she drove off into the desert anyway. Warnings don't always work, Earl agreed, because the thing about thin places is they don't just show you illusions. Sometimes they show you truth. Sometimes the thing you see out there in the darkness is exactly what you need, even if following it means leaving everything else behind. The trick is knowing the difference between what you need and what the thin place wants you to think you need. Dusty looked again toward the dirt road that led away from the gas station into the empty desert. He couldn't see far in the darkness, but his imagination filled in the details. Lucinda Pike driving her truck through terrain that shouldn't exist, chasing a vision of something that had seemed more real than reality itself. How many others had made the same choice? How many vehicles were out there right now, trapped in that eternal moment of pursuit, forever approaching a destination they would never reach? "I should go," Dusty said. "Get back to my truck, finish my rest break, get back on the highway come morning, leave this place behind and never think about it again." "That would be the smart choice," Earl said. "The safe choice. But you won't do it. You'll think about this place every time you drive Highway 50. You'll look for the light every time you pass through after dark. And one of these times, maybe next week, maybe next year, maybe 10 years from now, you'll see something out there in the desert. Something that looks familiar or desirable or necessary, and you'll have to make a choice." "I've already made my choice," Dusty said. "I'm choosing to leave. For now," Earl replied. "But the thin places are patient. They can wait. They have all the time in the world, and then some." Dusty turned and walked back toward the rest stop, not running, but not dawdling either, moving with the steady purpose of a man who's made a decision and intends to stick with it. Behind him, the gas station's light continued its subtle pulsing, and Earl Granger stood motionless beneath it, watching him go with eyes that had seen too many travelers make too many choices. When Dusty reached his truck, he climbed into the cab and locked the doors, an irrational gesture given that whatever he'd been talking to out there couldn't be kept at bay with simple mechanical locks. He sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, breathing heavily, trying to slow his racing heart. Through the windshield he could still see the gas station's light, still make out Earl's silhouette beneath it. As he watched, the attendant raised his arm in that familiar gesture, greeting or farewell or warning, before turning and walking slowly into the darkness beyond the light's reach. The gas station remained visible for perhaps another minute, its pulsing light gradually dimming, and then it was gone. The desert stretched away into darkness, empty and unremarkable. But Dusty knew it was still there, just beyond the range of his vision, waiting in whatever thin place it occupied when it wasn't manifesting itself to lost travelers. He climbed into the sleeper berth but didn't sleep. Instead, he lay awake, listening to the wind rattle against the truck's panels, listening to the occasional vehicle pass on the highway, listening to the silence of the desert night. And underneath it all, he thought he could hear other sounds, the sounds Earl had spoken of. Engines running in places where no engines should be, voices calling from the spaces between. When dawn finally broke over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Dusty climbed back into the driver's seat and started his engine. He pulled out of Devil's Throat rest stop and continued east on Highway 50, driving toward Fallon and his scheduled delivery. He didn't look back. Looking back seemed like the kind of thing that might invite trouble, might draw attention from things better left unnoticed. But he knew he would return to this stretch of highway. His job guaranteed it, and when he did, the gas station would be waiting, and Earl Granger would be standing beneath his light, and the choice Earl had spoken of would be waiting too. The choice between the road ahead and the road that led into the thin places, between the world that made sense and the world that existed in the cracks between moments. For now, Dusty chose the highway, but he wondered, as the miles rolled away beneath his wheels, how many more times he would make that choice, and what he would do on the day when the thing waiting in the desert looked more appealing than the empty road ahead. Winter came to the Nevada desert with its usual harshness, bringing freezing temperatures at night and winds that howled across the empty landscape like the voices of things that had never been alive. Warren. Dusty LeClaire continued his routes through the region, accepting loads that took him along Highway 50 with increasing frequency, though he would never have admitted to himself that he was deliberately choosing these assignments. Each time he passed Devil's Throat rest stop, he told himself he wouldn't stop, wouldn't look for the gas station's light, wouldn't seek out another conversation with Earl Granger. And each time as the miles rolled past and the rest stop receded in his mirrors, he felt something that might have been relief or might have been disappointment. The dreams started in December. Not nightmares exactly, but unsettling visions that came to him in the hours between sleep and waking, when his mind existed in that liminal space that wasn't quite conscious and wasn't quite unconscious. He would find himself driving through a landscape that resembled the Nevada desert, but wasn't quite right, the proportions slightly off, the colors subtly wrong, the horizon at an angle that defied normal geometry. In these dreams, he was always searching for something, following a light or a sound or a feeling that promised to lead him somewhere important. But he never arrived. The destination always remained just ahead, just out of reach, perpetually approaching but never getting closer. He mentioned the dreams once to another driver during a late-night conversation at a truck stop outside of Elko. The other man, a veteran hauler named Roy something or other, who'd been driving these routes even longer than Dusty had, listened with an expression that suggested he'd heard similar stories before. "Desert gets in your head," Roy had said, stirring his coffee with mechanical precision. "Especially Highway 50. Something about all that emptiness. Makes a man think thoughts he wouldn't think anywhere else. See things that aren't there. Or maybe see things that are there but shouldn't be." "Ever hear stories about strange gas stations?" Dusty asked, trying to sound casual. "Places that show up where they shouldn't be?" Roy had looked at him with sudden sharp attention, his eyes narrowing. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious. Heard some talk, is all." "Best not to be curious about some things," Roy said. "Highway 50's got a reputation for a reason. People disappear out there. Have been disappearing for as long as anyone can remember. Indians used to tell stories about it, about places where the world gets thin and things slip through. White folks came along and figured they knew better, built their highways right through those places, and now we drive through them every day without thinking about what we're driving through. You believe in that? Thin places?" Roy had been quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it might contain answers to questions he'd been asking for years. "I've been driving these routes for 43 years. I've seen things I can't explain. Things I don't talk about because talking about them makes them seem crazy. But crazy or not, they happened, and I learned a long time ago that the smart thing is to keep your eyes on the road, do your job, and don't go looking for trouble in the empty places." "But what if trouble finds you? What if you see something and you can't just ignore it?" "Then you drive faster," Roy said simply. "You keep moving, you don't stop, and you sure as hell don't follow lights that shouldn't be there. That's how people end up like Lucinda Pike." The mention of the name had startled Dusty. "You knew about her? Everyone who's been driving these routes long enough knows about her. And about the others. The ones who stopped at the wrong place at the wrong time and saw something they shouldn't have seen. Some of them drove away and were never quite right after. Some of them didn't drive away at all." Roy had leaned forward then, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There's a gas station out there. Old place. Shouldn't exist according to any map. But drivers see it sometimes, late at night when they're tired and the highway's empty. Most folks have the sense to keep driving, but some stop. And those who stop and talk to the attendant, well, they come away changed. If they come away at all." Dusty had wanted to press for more details, to ask if Roy had ever stopped there himself, to share his own experiences. But something in the older driver's expression suggested the conversation was over. They'd finished their coffee in silence, and when Dusty had returned to his truck, he'd found a note tucked under his wiper blade. Written in careful block letters, it said simply, "Don't go back." He never saw Roy again, asked around at other truck stops, tried to get a full name or a company affiliation, but nobody seemed to know who he was talking about. It was as if the conversation had never happened, as if Roy himself had been just another manifestation of the desert's strangeness, appearing briefly to deliver a warning before vanishing back into the empty miles. The note stayed on Dusty's dashboard for 3 weeks before he finally threw it away. But the message remained burned into his memory, a constant reminder that he was playing with forces he didn't understand. And still, he couldn't stop himself from looking for the gas station's light every time he drove past Devil's Throat rest stop, couldn't suppress the strange mixture of dread and anticipation that gripped him whenever he approached that section of highway. It was late January when things changed again. Dusty was hauling a load of construction equipment from Salt Lake City to Carson City, running behind schedule because of snow delays in the mountains. By the time he reached Highway 50, it was nearly midnight, and a winter storm was moving in from the north, bringing with it the promise of freezing rain and potentially treacherous driving conditions. The smart thing would have been to stop in Eureka and wait out the worst of the weather. But Dusty kept driving, pushing his luck, telling himself he could make it through before conditions deteriorated too badly. He was wrong. The freezing rain started falling about 20 miles east of Devil's Throat rest stop, coating the highway in a thin layer of ice that turned every curve into a potential disaster. Dusty reduced his speed to a crawl, his hands tight on the wheel, his attention focused completely on keeping the heavy truck under control. He was so concentrated on the immediate challenge of not sliding off the road that he almost missed the figure standing on the shoulder. Almost, but not quite. His headlights caught the shape of a person, a woman, standing beside what appeared to be an older model pickup truck, her arm raised in the universal signal for help. Dusty's instinct was to stop, decades of highway culture demanding that drivers help each other in times of trouble. But something about the scene triggered his internal alarms, the same instinct that had kept him alive through 32 years of long-haul trucking. The woman wasn't dressed for the weather, wearing only jeans and a light jacket that wouldn't provide nearly enough protection against the freezing rain. Her truck showed no signs of damage, no flat tire or smoking engine, nothing to explain why she'd be standing outside in these conditions. And she was standing exactly where Dusty remembered seeing the abandoned sedan 3 months ago, in the same spot where cars appeared and disappeared according to rules he didn't understand. He drove past without stopping, watching in his mirrors as the figure remained motionless on the shoulder, arms still raised, not turning to watch him go as a real stranded motorist would have done. The image stayed with him for the next several miles, burning in his mind with unnatural clarity. He'd seen her face briefly in the sweep of his headlights, and something about her features had seemed familiar, though he couldn't place where or when he might have encountered her before. Devil's Throat rest stop appeared in his headlights 10 minutes later. Dusty hadn't planned to stop, had every intention of continuing on despite the dangerous road conditions, but the freezing rain intensified suddenly, reducing visibility to near zero. Continuing in these conditions would be suicidal. He had no choice but to pull into the rest stop and wait for the storm to pass, or at least diminish enough to make driving feasible again. The parking area was empty, not another vehicle in sight despite the weather conditions that should have forced other travelers to seek shelter. Dusty positioned his truck in his usual spot and sat behind the wheel, engine idling, watching the freezing rain accumulate on his windshield. He didn't want to look for the gas station's light, didn't want to see if Earl Granger was standing out there in his impossible place, waiting with more warnings and cryptic explanations. But his eyes were drawn inevitably to the darkness beyond the rest stop, and there it was, that familiar pulsing glow, perhaps a bit brighter than before, or perhaps just more visible against the storm's darkness. Dusty sat for nearly half an hour, arguing with himself about what to do. The rational part of his mind insisted that staying in the truck was the only sensible choice, that venturing out into the storm to visit an impossible gas station would be the height of foolishness. But another part of him, a part that had been growing stronger with each passing week, wanted answers. Wanted to understand what was happening to him, why the thin place had chosen to reveal itself specifically to him, what connection existed between his presence and the manifestation of Earl Granger's gas station. He was still debating when he saw movement through the rain-streaked windshield. The woman from the highway, the one who'd been standing beside the broken-down truck, was walking across the rest stop parking area, heading directly toward the pulsing light of the gas station. She moved with purposeful strides, seemingly unbothered by the freezing rain that should have been soaking through her inadequate clothing. As she passed through the cone of illumination from one of the rest stop's lights, Dusty finally recognized her face. It was Lucinda Pike. Or rather, it was a woman who looked exactly like the photographs he'd found in the old newspaper articles about her disappearance. The same dark hair, the same determined expression, the same features that had stared out from grainy black and white images taken more than 40 years ago. She couldn't be Lucinda Pike, not the real woman who'd vanished in 1979, because that woman would be in her 70s by now if she were still alive. But the figure walking through the storm was young, perhaps in her mid-30s, exactly the age Lucinda had been when she'd driven off into the desert and never returned. Dusty was moving before he'd consciously decided to move, throwing open the truck's door and climbing down into the freezing rain. "Wait," he called out, his voice barely carrying over the storm's wind. "Stop!" The woman paused and turned to look at him. Her expression was blank, neither curious nor concerned, as if Dusty's presence was expected but not particularly important. "You can't help me," she said, her voice carrying with impossible clarity despite the distance and the storm. "Nobody can help me. I have to keep looking." "Looking for what?" Dusty asked, crossing the distance between them with quick strides, his boots crunching on the ice-covered pavement. "Home," she said simply. "I saw it out there, down that road. It looked exactly like home. But when I reached the place where it should have been, it was gone, moved further away. So I turned around and drove back, but the highway was gone too. There was just the desert, and the road, and the light that keeps showing me the way. I've been following it ever since." Up close, Dusty could see that she wasn't quite solid, her edges slightly blurred as if she existed at a different resolution than the rest of the world. The freezing rain fell through her rather than on her, and when she moved, there was a fractional delay, like watching someone on a video with poor synchronization. "How long have you been out here?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. I don't know, she said. Time doesn't work right. Sometimes it feels like I just left the highway a few minutes ago. Sometimes it feels like I've been driving forever. The gas station keeps appearing, and Earl keeps telling me I should give up, should accept that I'm lost. But I can't give up. If I give up, then I really am gone, really disappeared. As long as I keep looking, I'm still real, still exist, still have a chance of finding my way back. You're Lucinda Pike, Dusty said, and it wasn't a question. She focused on him more clearly, and for a moment, he could see recognition in her eyes, as if she were remembering something important. That was my name. Is my name. I'm not sure which anymore. Are you real? Or are you another part of this place? Another trick to keep me driving in circles? I'm real, Dusty said, though he was no longer entirely certain that was true. I'm a trucker. I stop here sometimes. I've talked to Earl. He told me about you. Earl, she repeated, and something like sadness crossed her translucent features. He tried to warn me, but I didn't listen. I thought I knew better, thought I could control what happened. Now I'm part of the thin place and I can't get out. She looked past him toward the gas station's light. You should go back to your truck. Don't end up like me. Don't follow the lights. What happens if you stop following them? Dusty asked. If you just stop, refuse to keep driving? I don't know, Lucinda said. I've never tried. I'm afraid of what might happen if I stop moving. Afraid I might disappear completely or become like Earl, stuck in one place forever. At least while I'm driving, while I'm searching, I'm still doing something, still have purpose. Without that, she trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. Dusty wanted to help her, wanted to offer some solution that would break the cycle and return her to the normal world. But what could he offer? He barely understood what was happening to himself, let alone how to rescue someone who'd been trapped in a thin place for 40 years. Is there anything I can do? He asked, knowing the answer before she gave it. Tell my sister I didn't suffer, Lucinda said. Tell her I'm still looking, still trying to get home. Tell her not to give up hope. Then she turned and continued walking toward the gas station, her form becoming less distinct with each step, until she merged with the darkness and the rain and was gone. Dusty stood alone in the freezing storm, watching the place where she'd disappeared. The gas station's light pulsed steadily, and beneath it, Earl Granger's silhouette was visible, standing in his eternal vigil. Dusty knew he should return to his truck, should lock the doors and wait out the storm and then drive away and never look back. But his feet carried him forward instead, toward the light, toward Earl, toward answers he wasn't sure he wanted but needed anyway. Earl was waiting for him, as always, standing in exactly the same position beneath the light. You saw her, he said as Dusty approached. Lucinda, she comes through sometimes, cycling back through this spot, still looking for what she lost. Time's a circle for her now. She drives away, gets lost, comes back, drives away again. Over and over, no beginning, no end. Can she be saved? Dusty asked. Is there any way to bring her back? Back to what? Earl replied. The world she left behind doesn't exist anymore. Everyone she knew has aged 40 years or died. The roads she drove have been repaved. The places she knew have been torn down and rebuilt. Even if she could find her way back to the normal world, what would she be returning to? She's a ghost from 1979, and this is 2020. She doesn't fit anymore. So she's just trapped forever? Forever's a long time, Earl said. The thin places don't last forever. Eventually, they collapse, or dissolve, or whatever it is they do when reality finally patches over the holes. When that happens, the things caught in them either get absorbed or released. But that could be tomorrow, or 100 years from now. No way to know. Dusty felt a weight settling over him, the crushing realization that there were problems in the world with no solutions, tragedies that couldn't be undone, people beyond saving no matter how much you might want to help them. "Why are you showing me this?" he demanded, anger suddenly flaring up to replace the sadness. "Why keep dragging me back here, showing me these things? What do you want from me?" "I don't want anything from you," Earl said calmly. "The thin place does the wanting, and what it wants is complicated. Maybe it's trying to warn you. Maybe it's trying to claim you. Maybe it's just showing you the truth about what lies beneath the surface of the ordinary world. There are places where reality breaks down, where the rules stop applying, where people can get lost in ways that don't make sense. You need to decide whether you're going to acknowledge that truth and live with it, or whether you're going to keep denying it until it's too late." "Too late for what?" "Too late to choose," Earl said. "Right now, you can still walk away. Return to your truck, drive back to the highway, continue your life as if none of this ever happened. But if you keep coming back, keep seeking out the thin place, eventually it will stop being a choice. Eventually, you'll be like Lucinda, caught in the cycle, unable to break free even if you wanted to." "Then, why do I keep coming back?" Dusty asked, genuinely confused by his own behavior. "Why can't I just leave it alone?" "Because you're looking for something too," Earl said. "Maybe you don't know what it is yet. Maybe you'll never know. But the thin place recognizes that searching, that emptiness that needs to be filled, and it offers to fill it, in its own way. Not with answers, not with solutions, but with continuation, with the eternal possibility that maybe, just maybe, the next time you follow the light, you'll find what you've been looking for." The freezing rain continued to fall, but Dusty no longer felt the cold. He stood in the strange bubble of reality that surrounded Earl's gas station, where the normal rules didn't quite apply, and he understood with terrible clarity what the attendant was telling him. The thin place was offering him an escape from the emptiness of his existence, from the endless miles and empty truck stops and lonely nights. But the escape it offered was worse than what he'd be escaping from. It was a trap disguised as a promise, a prison disguised as freedom. "I won't come back," Dusty said, and this time he meant it. "This is the last time. I'm going to drive away, and I'm going to stay away, and whatever happens here, whatever the thin place wants, it's going to have to find someone else." "Maybe you will," Earl said. "Maybe you're stronger than the others. Maybe you can resist the pull. I hope so. For your sake. I genuinely hope so." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something that might have been emotion, though it was so faint that Dusty couldn't identify what kind. "But I've been here a long time, driver. Long enough to see patterns. Long enough to know that people who say never again usually mean not yet. The thin place is patient. It can wait." Dusty turned and walked back toward his truck, forcing himself not to look back, not to acknowledge the gas station or its attendant or any of the impossibilities he'd witnessed. The freezing rain soaked through his clothing immediately, shocking him with its cold, reminding him that he was still part of the normal world, still subject to its rules and limitations. He climbed into his truck's cab, stripped off his wet jacket, and cranked the heater to maximum. Through the windshield he could still see the gas station's light, still make out Earl's motionless form. And beyond that, barely visible through the storm, he thought he could see other lights moving through the darkness, headlights from vehicles that existed in the spaces between, driven by people who'd made the choice he was determined not to make. The storm passed eventually, as desert storms always do. By 3 a.m, the freezing rain had stopped, and the clouds had broken apart enough to reveal stars burning cold and distant in the black sky. Dusty started his engine, checked his mirrors, and pulled out of Devil's Throat rest stop. In his rearview mirror, the gas station was gone, leaving only empty desert and darkness. But he knew it was still there, waiting just beyond the edge of perception, ready to manifest again the next time he drove this route. Ready to show him more impossible things, to whisper more promises about roads that led to places that couldn't exist. And despite everything Earl had told him, despite his determination to stay away, Dusty knew with cold certainty that he would see that light again. The only question was whether he would have the strength to keep driving past it when he did. Spring came late to the Nevada desert in 2020, bringing with it temperatures that fluctuated wildly between freezing nights and scorching afternoons. Warren "Dusty" LeClaire marked the changing seasons by the loads he hauled and the roads he traveled. And by March, he'd managed to arrange his schedule so that most of his routes avoided Highway 50 entirely. It wasn't difficult to do, just a matter of accepting slightly longer hauls through different corridors, routes that added hours to his trips, but kept him away from Devil's Throat rest stop and the impossible things that waited there in the darkness. He told himself he was being smart, being cautious, following Earl Granger's advice to stay away from the thin place before it was too late to choose. But in quieter moments, usually late at night when sleep wouldn't come, and he lay in his sleeper berth listening to the sounds of whatever truck stop he'd chosen for the night, Dusty admitted to himself that he wasn't avoiding the place out of wisdom. He was avoiding it out of fear. Fear not of what the thin place might do to him, but of what he might choose to do when confronted with it again. Because Earl had been right about one thing. Dusty was searching for something, had been searching for most of his adult life without quite realizing it. He'd thought he was searching for success, then for love, then for some kind of meaning in the endless miles he drove. But success had proven empty, love had proven temporary, and meaning remained as elusive as ever. At 57, he was beginning to suspect that what he'd really been searching for all along was an escape, a way out of the life he'd built that had somehow become a prison of his own making. The thin place offered that escape. It promised roads that led to impossible destinations, journeys that never ended, searches that could continue forever without the disappointment of arrival. And that promise was seductive in a way Dusty hadn't anticipated. Dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with physical threat and everything to do with the simple human desire to stop struggling, to give up the burden of choice, to let something else decide what came next. His daughter called in early April, the first time he'd heard from her in nearly 8 months. The conversation was stilted and brief, filled with the awkward pauses of two people who'd once been close but had let too much time and distance accumulate between them. She was getting married in June, she told him. She wanted him to be there, wanted him to walk her down the aisle, even though they both knew he'd been absent for most of the important moments in her life. Dusty agreed immediately, promised he would be there, promised he wouldn't let her down this time. After the call ended, he sat in his truck's cab and stared at the Nevada landscape rolling past his windows, and he felt something crack inside him. The wedding was in Colorado, an easy drive from wherever he happened to be. There was no reason he couldn't make it, no excuse that would hold up under examination. But the idea of being there, of participating in that ritual of family and connection, filled him with an anxiety he couldn't explain. It wasn't that he didn't love his daughter. He did, desperately, in the inarticulate way of men who'd never learned how to express such things properly. But love wasn't enough. It had never been enough. He took a load, heading east 2 days later, telling himself he was moving in the right direction, getting closer to Colorado and the wedding that was still 2 months away. But the route he'd chosen would take him through central Nevada, would put him back on Highway 50 for a long stretch through the emptiest part of the desert. He told himself it was just practical, the most efficient route given his starting point and destination. But he knew he was lying to himself. He was going back to Devil's Throat, going back to the thin place, because some part of him needed to see it one more time before his daughter's wedding, needed to confront the choice Earl had warned him about while he still had the strength to make the right decision. The rest stop appeared in his headlights just after midnight on a moonless night in mid-April. Dusty had been driving for 11 hours, pushing the legal limits, and his body ached with the familiar exhaustion of too many miles with too little rest. The parking area was empty as always, the fluorescent lights casting their sickly glow over cracked pavement that never seemed to accumulate the dust and debris that covered everything else in the desert. He pulled into his usual spot, went through his shutdown routine, and sat behind the wheel waiting for the inevitable. The gas station's light appeared almost immediately, pulsing with that same steady rhythm that might have been a heartbeat or might have been something else entirely. Earl Granger was there beneath it, standing in his eternal vigil, and Dusty knew without question that the attendant had been expecting him, had known he would return despite his promises and determination. The thin place always knew. That was part of its power. Dusty climbed down from his truck and walked toward the gas station without hesitation, without the internal debate that had characterized his previous visits. This time felt different somehow, felt final in a way he couldn't articulate but understood instinctively. This was the moment Earl had warned him about, the point where choice became destiny, where what he decided in the next few minutes would determine everything that followed. Earl watched him approach, with what might have been sadness in his posture, a heaviness that suggested he'd seen this scene play out before with other travelers, other lost souls who'd returned to the thin place one time too many. "Figured you'd be back," Earl said as Dusty stopped before him. "Most folks can't stay away once they've seen what's out there. The normal world starts to feel like the illusion, and the thin places start to feel like the only real thing left." "I'm not staying," Dusty said, though the words lacked conviction. "I just needed to see it again. To understand." "Understand what?" Earl asked. "What is there to understand beyond what I've already told you? This is a thin place where reality breaks down and people get lost. You've seen what happens to those who follow the lights. You've talked to Lucinda Pike, seen what 40 years of searching in the spaces between has done to her. You know the truth. So, what more do you need to understand?" "Why me?" Dusty asked, the question that had been building in him for months finally breaking free. "Why does the thin place show itself to me? There must be hundreds of truckers who drive past here every week. Why am I the one who sees the gas station, who talks to you, who gets pulled back again and again?" Earl was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was revealing something he rarely shared. "Because you're already halfway gone. The thin place doesn't create emptiness in people. It finds the emptiness that's already there and offers to fill it. Most folks, they've got enough connection to the normal world to resist. They've got family they care about, jobs that matter to them, dreams they're still chasing. But you've been running from everything that might anchor you for so long that there's nothing left holding you to the world that makes sense. You're like a boat that's slipped its moorings, drifting further from shore with every passing day. The thin place recognizes that. It calls to people like you because you're already lost. All it's offering is a different kind of lost, one where you can keep moving forever without ever having to arrive anywhere or be anyone." The words hit Dusty like physical blows, each one finding its mark with painful accuracy. He wanted to deny what Earl was saying, to insist that he had connections and purposes and reasons to stay in the normal world, but the denial wouldn't come. His daughter's upcoming wedding, the event that should have been pulling him toward family and responsibility, felt more like an obligation than a joy. The thought of standing in a church surrounded by people who knew how absent he'd been, how he'd chosen the road over everything else time and time again, filled him not with anticipation, but with a hollow anxiety that made him want to run. "My daughter's getting married," Dusty said, needing to speak the words aloud even though they felt like they belonged to someone else's life. "In June. I promised I'd be there." "Will you?" Earl asked, and the question contained no judgment, just a simple curiosity about what Dusty would choose. "I don't know," Dusty admitted, and the honesty of it felt like defeat. "Part of me wants to be there, wants to be the father she deserves, wants to make up for all the times I wasn't there before. But another part of me knows I'll just disappoint her again, that I don't know how to be what she needs, that I'm better at leaving than at staying." "So you're thinking about taking the other road," Earl said, gesturing toward the darkness beyond the gas station where that dirt road led away into impossible distances. "Following the light like Lucinda did, becoming part of the thin place, existing in the spaces between where you never have to make a choice about being present, because present stops meaning anything." "Would it be so wrong?" Dusty asked, surprising himself with the question. "If I'm just going to keep disappointing everyone, keep failing at being the person I should be, maybe it would be better to just disappear. At least then there'd be a reason. I'd be the trucker who vanished on Highway 50. Another mysterious disappearance." She could tell people her father was lost in the desert, and that would be easier to accept than the truth that her father just couldn't stop running long enough to be there for the important moments. Earl shook his head slowly. "You think disappearing would be a kindness? That it would spare her pain? I've seen a lot of people make that calculation over the years, and it's always wrong. The ones left behind, they don't get closure from unexplained disappearances. They get decades of wondering, of hoping, of creating stories about what might have happened. Lucinda Pike's sister still lives in Sacramento, still keeps a candle in the window every night, still believes that maybe someday her sister will find her way home. That's not mercy. That's a different kind of cruelty." "Then what am I supposed to do?" Dusty demanded, frustration and despair mixing in his voice. "Keep driving these routes. Keep pretending I have a life worth living. Keep disappointing everyone who makes the mistake of depending on me." "What kind of choice is that?" "It's the only choice that matters," Earl said. "The choice to keep trying even when you're tired, to keep showing up even when you think you'll fail, to stay in the world that makes sense even when the world that doesn't make sense seems easier. Nobody can make that choice for you. Not me, not your daughter, not anyone. You have to decide whether you're going to keep fighting to be present, or whether you're going to give up and let the thin place take you." Dusty looked past Earl toward the dirt road that led into the desert. In the darkness, he could see lights moving, headlights from vehicles that existed in the spaces between moments. He could hear engines running, could hear voices calling from distances that couldn't be measured in miles. And underneath it all, he could feel the pull of the thin place, the seductive promise that if he just started driving down that road, all his struggles would end. Not in death exactly, but in something else, in eternal motion without destination, in searching without the pain of never finding. It would be so easy to follow those lights, to climb into his truck, point it toward the impossible road, and just start driving. To become like Lucinda Pike, existing in the cracks between moments, forever approaching home without ever arriving. No more weddings to attend, no more disappointments to deliver, no more failures to accumulate. Just the road, endless and eternal, leading nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. But as Dusty stood there considering that choice, another image came to mind. His daughter, at 7 years old, riding on his shoulders through a truck stop parking lot, laughing at the sheer height of it, trusting completely that he would hold her safe. He hadn't been a good father even then, had already missed more birthdays and school events than he'd attended. But in that moment, for those few minutes, he'd been present. He'd been there, and it had mattered to her. He'd seen it in her face, in the joy that came not from anything expensive or elaborate, but from the simple fact of his presence. "I can't promise I'll be a good father," Dusty said quietly, still staring at the lights in the desert. "I can't promise I'll stop disappointing her, or that I'll suddenly figure out how to be the person she needs, but I can promise to be there in June. I can promise to walk her down that aisle, even if I don't deserve the honor. And maybe that's enough. Maybe showing up, even when you're scared and uncertain, maybe that counts for something." Earl nodded slowly. "It counts for more than you think. Showing up is the first choice, and sometimes it's the hardest one. Everything else builds from there." Dusty turned away from the desert lights and looked back toward his truck, solid and real in the parking area of Devil's Throat rest stop. "What happens now?" he asked. "Do I just drive away and never see this place again? Does the thin place let me go that easily?" "The thin place doesn't let anyone go," Earl said. "It's always there, always waiting, always ready to manifest for those who can see it. You'll drive this route again, and you'll see the gas station's light again, and you'll have to make the choice again. That's how it works. The thin place is patient. It can wait years, decades, for someone to finally be worn down enough to follow the lights. But knowing you'll have to keep choosing, that's better than not knowing. You can't fight what you don't understand." "And you?" Dusty asked. "How long will you keep standing here warning travelers?" "Until the thin place collapses, or I figure out how to leave, or something else changes the equation," Earl replied. "Time doesn't mean much here. Could be tomorrow, could be 1,000 years from now. But as long as I'm here, as long as the gas station manifests, I'll keep telling people the truth about what they're seeing. It's the only purpose I have left." Dusty wanted to offer some comfort, some hope that Earl might eventually find his way out of the thin place. But the words wouldn't come, and he suspected they'd be hollow anyway. Some traps couldn't be escaped. Some choices couldn't be unmade. Earl Granger had followed his own lights decades ago, and now he existed as a warning to others, a cautionary tale rendered in flesh and impossibility. "Thank you," Dusty said, because no other words seemed adequate. "Don't thank me yet," Earl replied. "You haven't made it to that wedding. You haven't proven you can resist the next time you see the lights. Thank me if you make it to the other side of this still yourself, still present in the world that makes sense. Until then, just keep driving, keep choosing, keep showing up." Dusty walked back to his truck through the cold desert night, and this time he didn't look back at the gas station or its attendant. He climbed into the cab, started the engine, and pulled out of the rest stop. In his mirrors, he watched the gas station's light fade and disappear, leaving only empty desert behind him. But he knew it would return. The thin place was always waiting, always ready to manifest for those who could see it. He drove through the night and reached his delivery point in eastern Nevada by mid-morning. From there, he picked up another load heading toward Colorado, another step closer to his daughter's wedding. The miles rolled by beneath his wheels, measured in fuel stops and rest breaks and the endless white lines that divided the highway. And with each mile, Dusty felt something shift inside him, a subtle reorientation toward presence rather than absence, toward showing up rather than running away. The wedding happened on a June afternoon, bright with sunshine and possibility. Dusty stood in a small church in Fort Collins, wearing a suit he'd bought specifically for the occasion, and watched his daughter approach in her white dress. She was radiant, beautiful, more grown up than he could quite comprehend. When she reached him and took his arm, She looked up at him with eyes that held all the complicated mixture of love and disappointment and hope that defined their relationship. "You're here," she whispered, and her voice held surprise that cut him more deeply than any accusation could have. "I'm here," he confirmed, and meant it with every part of himself. They walked down the aisle together, father and daughter, two people trying to bridge decades of distance in a few brief steps. It wasn't redemption, wasn't a magical healing of all the wounds his absence had created, but it was presence. It was showing up, and as Earl had promised, it counted for something. After the ceremony, after the reception, after all the rituals of celebration had concluded, Dusty found a quiet moment alone in the church's parking lot. He stood beside his truck, looking up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and thought about thin places and impossible choices and roads that led to nowhere. The pull was still there. The temptation to climb into his cab and start driving west toward Nevada, and the familiar emptiness of Highway 50. Part of him would always want to return to Devil's Throat, would always be searching for Earl Granger's gas station and the escape it offered. But he'd made his choice. Not a permanent choice, not a choice that would hold forever without effort or doubt. Just a choice to be present today, in this moment, and to try to make the same choice tomorrow. To keep showing up, keep choosing connection over isolation, keep staying in the world that made sense even when the world that didn't make sense seemed easier. His daughter found him there in the parking lot, still in her wedding dress, her new husband waiting patiently by the church entrance. "Dad?" she said, and her voice held a question she didn't quite know how to ask. "I was just thinking," Dusty said, "about the road, about how much time I've spent driving away from things instead of toward them." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "You don't have to explain. I know the road is who you are. I'm glad you were here today. It meant a lot." "To me, too," Dusty said, and found that it was true. Being present had been harder than he'd expected, more emotionally draining than any long haul he'd ever driven. But it had also been more rewarding than he could have articulated, more real than anything he'd experienced in years of chasing mile markers and delivery deadlines. They embraced awkwardly, as they always did, two people who loved each other but didn't quite know how to express it properly. Then she returned to her husband, and Dusty climbed into his truck. He had a load waiting for him in Wyoming, another delivery, another stretch of highway calling his name. The road was still who he was, but maybe, just maybe, it didn't have to be all he was. As he drove north out of Fort Collins, Dusty thought about Earl Granger standing beneath his impossible light, still warning travelers about thin places and the choices they represented. He thought about Lucinda Pike driving endlessly through the spaces between moments, forever searching for a home she would never reach. And he thought about himself, aging trucker trying to navigate the space between the life he'd lived and the life he wished he'd lived, between presence and absence, between the road that made sense and the road that led to nowhere. The highway stretched ahead of him, white lines disappearing into darkness, and Dusty followed them, not because he had to, not because he couldn't imagine any other existence, but because he chose to. And that choice, as small and temporary as it was, made all the difference. He would drive Highway 50 again, would see the gas station's light pulsing in the Nevada darkness, would hear the call of the thin place whispering promises about roads that never ended, and searches that never concluded. But he would keep driving past, keep choosing the harder path, keep showing up for the moments that mattered. Not perfectly, not without doubt or struggle, but he would keep trying, because in the end, that was all anyone could do. Keep trying, keep choosing, keep moving through the world that made sense, even when the world that didn't make sense seemed so much easier. The thin places would always be waiting, always ready to offer escape to those worn down by the weight of presence. But they weren't the only choice. They were just the easiest one, and sometimes the hardest choices were the ones most worth making. Years later, other truckers driving Highway 50 through central Nevada would occasionally report seeing strange lights in the desert, or an impossible gas station that appeared where no gas station should be, or a weathered attendant who warned them about thin places and eternal roads. Some would heed the warnings, some would follow the lights, and some would drive past, choosing presence over absence, choosing the struggle of the real world over the seduction of the spaces between. They never found Lucinda Pike's truck, never solved the mystery of her disappearance. Her sister kept the candle burning in the window until she died in 2023, still hoping that maybe someday her lost sister would find her way home. And on certain nights, when the desert got quiet and the air got cold, travelers along Highway 50 reported seeing headlights moving parallel to the highway through terrain where no road existed. A truck driving endlessly through the darkness, still searching, still hoping, still lost in the thin places where time didn't mean what it should, and home was always just ahead, but never quite reachable. Warren Dusty LeClaire kept driving until he was 63, when a minor heart attack convinced him it was finally time to retire. He bought a small house outside of Elko, Nevada, close enough to Highway 50 that he could see trucks passing in the distance, but far enough away that the road no longer defined his every waking moment. His daughter visited sometimes, bringing grandchildren he was learning to know. And on clear nights he would stand on his porch and look toward the empty desert, toward the place where Devil's Throat rest stop waited in the darkness, and he would remember Earl Granger and the choices that had defined his later years. The thin place was still out there, still calling, still offering escape to those who could hear its voice. But Dusty had made his choice, and he chose to keep making it every day. It wasn't easy. It was never easy. But it was real, and real was enough. The rest stop remained on the maps, a small crescent of pavement and concrete in the endless Nevada desert. And sometimes, late at night, when the moon was dark and the stars burned cold and distant, a gas station would appear just beyond the edge of the parking area, its light pulsing with the rhythm of something that might have been a heartbeat or might have been something else entirely. And beneath that light, a figure would stand in eternal vigil, waiting to warn the next lost traveler about the roads that led to nowhere and the choice between presence and absence that everyone had to make eventually. The desert kept its secrets. The thin places remained thin. And the highway rolled on into darkness, leading everywhere and nowhere, offering escape and imprisonment in equal measure to those who chose to follow where it led. Virgil Tatum had been hauling freight across the Midwest for 26 years, and in that time he'd developed an almost supernatural ability to read weather patterns, not through meteorological training or sophisticated instruments, but through the kind of bone-deep understanding that came from spending most of his adult life watching storms build and break across the flat expanse of America's heartland. So, when he left Topeka on the evening of September 3, 2018, with a load of industrial machinery bound for Kansas City, he knew within the first 30 miles that he was driving toward something worse than the Weather Service had predicted. The forecast had called for scattered thunderstorms, nothing unusual for early September in Kansas. But the sky ahead of him was developing the particular shade of greenish-gray that experienced truckers recognized as a warning sign, the color that preceded tornadic activity and the kind of storms that could flip an empty trailer or strip the paint off a truck's cab with hail the size of golf balls. Virgil had seen that color before, had learned to respect it, and under normal circumstances would have pulled off at the first available truck stop to wait out whatever was coming. But these weren't normal circumstances. The machinery he was hauling was needed for an emergency repair at a manufacturing plant that had already been offline for 3 days, costing the company tens of thousands of dollars for every hour of continued downtime. His dispatcher had been explicit about the delivery timeline, and Virgil's contract included penalty clauses that would cost him more than he could afford if he arrived late without a documented emergency. So he kept driving, kept pushing west on Interstate 70, and told himself that he could outrun the worst of the storm if he maintained his speed and didn't stop for anything but fuel. At 51 years old, Virgil should have known better. Should have recognized that no delivery was worth driving directly into a severe weather system, that no contract penalty was worth dying for. But he'd made a career out of threading the needle between caution and necessity, between the safe choice and the profitable one. It had worked for 26 years. He saw no reason why it shouldn't work tonight. The first drops of rain hit his windshield at 7:47 p.m., just as he passed the exit for Salina. Within minutes, the rain had intensified to a torrential downpour that reduced visibility to perhaps 50 feet, forcing Virgil to slow from his cruising speed of 65 to a crawl of 35. Lightning split the darkening sky with alarming frequency, each flash illuminating the flat Kansas landscape in stark white relief before plunging it back into premature darkness. Thunder followed seconds later, so loud that Virgil could feel it through the truck's frame, a physical presence that spoke of forces beyond human control. His CB radio crackled with chatter from other truckers, voices discussing the storm's intensity and debating whether to continue or seek shelter. Most were opting to stop, pulling into whatever facility they could find to wait out the worst of the weather. Virgil considered joining them, but a quick check of his GPS showed that the next truck stop with adequate parking was nearly 40 miles ahead. Between his current position and that destination lay nothing but empty highway and the occasional rest area, none of which would provide meaningful protection if the storm spawned a tornado. He was weighing his options when the hail started. Small at first, pea-sized pellets that clattered against the truck's metal surfaces like thousands of tiny hammers. Then larger marble-sized stones that struck with enough force to make Virgil flinch with each impact. He knew that if the hail grew much bigger, it could crack his windshield or damage his cargo, both of which would result in the very delays and costs he was trying to avoid. He needed to get off the highway, needed to find shelter immediately. As if in answer to his need, a highway sign appeared in his headlights, partially obscured by the driving rain but still legible. Rest area, 2 miles. Virgil had passed this particular rest stop dozens of times over the years without ever stopping there, mainly because it was small and rarely busy, offering nothing more than restrooms and a few picnic tables. But right now, it represented the only available shelter within reach. He signaled and moved into the right lane, preparing to exit. The rest stop sat in a shallow depression about a quarter-mile off the interstate, accessed by a curved service road that descended below the level of the surrounding farmland. It was an older facility, dating back to the 60s or 70s based on the architectural style, with a single long building that housed the restrooms and a parking area large enough for perhaps 20 vehicles. As Virgil's truck descended the access road, the intensity of the storm seemed to diminish slightly, as if the depression provided some natural protection from the worst of the wind and hail. The parking area was empty, which surprised him, given the severity of the weather. He'd expected to find at least a few other travelers sheltering here, but not a single car or truck occupied the painted spaces. The building itself was illuminated by overhead lights that cast sickly pools of yellow across the wet pavement, creating an atmosphere that struck Virgil as vaguely unwelcoming despite the shelter it offered. But he was in no position to be particular. He maneuvered his truck into a spot near the center of the lot, positioning it to use the building as a windbreak, and went through his shutdown procedure. The dashboard clock read 8:23 p.m. If the storm passed quickly, he might still make his delivery window. If it lasted more than a few hours, he'd have to call his dispatcher and explain the delay, weather documentation or no weather documentation. But for now, there was nothing to do but wait and hope that the worst of the system would move through without dropping a tornado on his head. Virgil sat behind the wheel for perhaps 10 minutes, watching the rain stream down his windshield and listening to the thunder roll across the prairie. The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it seemed to be intensifying, with lightning strikes coming so frequently that they created an almost continuous strobe effect, turning the world outside into a series of frozen moments rather than a continuous flow of time. During one particularly bright flash, Virgil noticed something that made him lean forward and squint through the rain-streaked glass. There was another vehicle in the parking lot, not parked in one of the designated spaces, but sitting at an odd angle near the far end of the building, partially hidden in shadows that shouldn't have been quite so dark given the overhead lighting. It was a car, an older sedan from what Virgil could tell in the intermittent lightning flashes, and it had the abandoned look of a vehicle that had been sitting in one place for far too long. The windows were filmed with grime. The body showed patches of rust, and one of the rear tires appeared to be flat. Virgil was certain the car hadn't been there when he'd pulled in. He'd scanned the entire parking area as a part of his standard situational awareness routine, and that section had been empty. Yet there the vehicle sat, as if it had materialized in the few minutes since his arrival. The rational explanation was that he'd simply missed it in the darkness and rain, that his attention had been focused on finding a good parking spot rather than conducting a thorough survey of the area. But something about the car's appearance nagged at him, triggered that same instinct that had kept him safe through 26 years of long-haul trucking. He was still studying the mysterious sedan when movement caught his eye near the rest stop building. A figure had emerged from the restroom area, moving with an odd, shuffling gait that suggested either injury or extreme exhaustion. The person, Virgil couldn't tell if it was a man or woman from this distance and in this lighting, wore what appeared to be a uniform of some kind, though the details were obscured by the rain and darkness. They walked toward the abandoned sedan, paused beside it for a moment as if inspecting it, then turned and looked directly at Virgil's truck. Even across the distance and through the rain, Virgil felt the weight of that gaze. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it wasn't friendly either. It was assessing, measuring, as if the figure was trying to determine something important about him or his truck or his presence in this place. The attention made Virgil uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite articulate, made him wish he'd pushed on to the next truck stop, despite the hail and reduced visibility. The figure stood motionless for perhaps 30 seconds, then turned and walked back toward the building, disappearing around the corner into shadows that seemed deeper than they should have been. Virgil waited for them to reappear, but they didn't. The parking area was empty again except for his truck and the mysterious sedan, and the storm continued to rage with undiminished fury. Virgil's CB radio crackled to life, startling him from his observations. A voice, distorted by static and barely audible over the interference caused by the storm, said something he couldn't quite make out. He adjusted the squelch and volume, trying to clean up the signal, but the voice had already faded back into white noise. He tried calling out, asking if anyone was on the channel, but received no response. The radio had probably just picked up some random transmission, perhaps from another trucker miles away, the signal bouncing off the storm's electrical activity in unpredictable ways. But as Virgil set the microphone back in its cradle, he could have sworn he heard the voice again, clearer this time despite the static. It sounded like it was saying, "Get out," or maybe, "Get help," or possibly something else entirely. The storm's interference made it impossible to be certain. Virgil tried the radio again, but now there was nothing but dead air, not even the usual background chatter from the CB channels. He checked his cell phone and found, unsurprisingly, that he had no signal. The rest stop was in a depression, and the storm was creating interference. Under normal circumstances, that wouldn't have bothered him, But these circumstances were feeling less normal with each passing minute. The abandoned car that might not have been there when he arrived. The figure in the uniform who'd appeared and disappeared in ways that didn't quite make sense. The strange voice on the CB radio. Individually, each incident could be explained away. Together, they created a pattern that Virgil's instincts recognized as dangerous, even if his rational mind couldn't explain why. He considered starting his engine and leaving, storm or no storm, penalty clauses be damned. But before he could act on the impulse, another lightning flash illuminated the parking area, and what he saw in that brief moment of stark illumination made his blood run cold. The abandoned sedan was gone. Not moved to a different location, not hidden by changed shadows, but simply absent. The space where it had been sitting was empty, showing nothing but wet pavement and faded parking lines. Virgil's mind raced through explanations. Maybe it had never been there, maybe he'd been seeing things, fatigue and stress creating hallucinations out of shadows and rain. Maybe the figure in the uniform had somehow driven it away, while Virgil was distracted with the radio, though that seemed impossible given the timing and the fact that he'd heard no engine start. Or maybe, and this was the explanation his instincts were screaming at him despite its impossibility, something very wrong was happening at this rest stop. Something that had nothing to do with weather or fatigue or normal mechanical explanations. The lightning flashed again, and in that moment of illumination, Virgil saw something that convinced him beyond any doubt that he needed to leave immediately. The building itself, the long concrete structure that housed the restrooms, looked different. Not dramatically so, but subtly wrong in ways that his brain struggled to process. The architecture was the same, but the details were off. The doors were in slightly different positions. The windows were a different size. The paint color had changed from weathered beige to a faded green he was certain hadn't been there when he'd arrived. And standing near the entrance, clearly visible in the lightning's stark light, were multiple figures in uniforms. Not just the one he'd seen earlier, but 4 or 5 of them, all standing motionless in the rain, all facing toward his truck with that same assessing, measuring gaze. When the lightning faded and darkness returned, the figures remained visible as dark silhouettes against the building's lights, unmoving and inexplicable. Virgil's hand moved toward the ignition key, but before he could turn it, the storm intensified with shocking suddenness. Wind that had been strong became violent, buffeting his truck with enough force to rock it on its suspension. The rain changed from heavy downpour to near solid wall of water, reducing visibility to 0. And the lightning, which had been frequent but scattered, became continuous, creating a strobe effect that made normal perception impossible, turning the world into a series of disconnected still images rather than continuous motion. In one flash, the figures were standing near the building. In the next, they were closer, perhaps halfway across the parking lot. In the next, closer still, moving toward his truck with that same odd, shuffling gait, spreading out to approach from multiple angles. Virgil turned the key, and his engine roared to life with a sound that seemed impossibly loud despite the storm's fury. He shifted into gear, released the brake, and prepared to floor the accelerator regardless of what might be in his path. But in the next lightning flash, the figures were gone. The parking area was empty again, showing nothing but wet pavement and the unchanged rest stop building with its normal beige paint and correctly positioned doors. The abandoned sedan was absent, the uniformed figures had vanished, and everything looked exactly as it should have looked when he'd first arrived. If not for his racing heart and the cold sweat that had broken out across his skin, Virgil might have convinced himself that the last few minutes had been nothing but a vivid hallucination brought on by stress and fatigue. He sat with his hand on the gear shift, engine running, trying to decide if he should still flee or if he'd been seeing things that weren't there. The storm continued to rage, but its intensity had dropped back to merely severe rather than apocalyptic. His rational mind insisted that leaving now, driving back out into hail and reduced visibility, would be more dangerous than staying put until conditions improved. But his instincts, honed by 26 years of survival on America's highways, were screaming at him to run, to get as far from this place as possible before whatever was happening here happened again. The decision was made for him when a pair of headlights appeared at the top of the access road descending toward the rest stop. Another vehicle seeking shelter from the storm, arriving at exactly the moment when Virgil most needed the reassurance of normal human presence. He watched the vehicle, a highway patrol cruiser based on its distinctive profile and light bar, navigate carefully down the wet road and pull into the parking area about 50 feet from his truck. The officer who emerged from the cruiser wore a rain slicker and moved with the purposeful efficiency of someone accustomed to working in adverse conditions. He walked directly to Virgil's truck and tapped on the driver's side window. Virgil, grateful for any contact with another person after the disturbing events of the last few minutes, rolled down his window despite the rain that immediately began blowing into the cab. "Evening," the officer said, raising his voice to be heard over the storm. "Highway Patrol, name's Clayton Reeve. Saw you pull in here and wanted to check that everything's all right. This storm's nastier than the Weather Service predicted. They're recording straight-line winds of 60 miles per hour, about 10 miles west of here, and there's a tornado warning in effect for this county." "Virgil Tatum," Virgil replied, oddly comforted by the normalcy of the interaction. "Was heading to Kansas City when the hail started. Figured I'd better get off the road before it got worse." Clayton nodded, rain dripping from the brim of his campaign hat. "Smart choice. This storm's producing hail up to 2 inches in diameter in some cells. Can you believe they're calling this just severe thunderstorms? Feels more like the end of the world out here." He paused, seeming to notice something in Virgil's expression. "You all right? You look like you've seen something." Virgil hesitated, unsure how to explain what he'd witnessed without sounding insane. But something about Clayton's demeanor, a combination of professionalism and genuine concern, made him want to share what had happened. "Have there been any reports of strange activity at this rest stop?" he asked. "Abandoned vehicles, people acting unusual, anything like that?" Clayton's expression changed subtly, a flicker of something that might have been recognition or concern crossing his features before being replaced by professional neutrality. "Why do you ask?" "Just saw some things that didn't quite make sense. Probably nothing, just the storm playing tricks with the light in my tired eyes. But it made me uncomfortable." Clayton was quiet for a moment, rain drumming against his slicker, lightning continuing to paint the sky in shades of white and purple. When he spoke again, his voice had taken on a different quality, less official and more personal. "This rest stop has a history. Not the kind of thing we advertise, and not something I'd normally discuss with civilians. But if you saw something here, if you felt something was wrong, then you need to know what you're dealing with. You got a few minutes to talk inside your cab? Getting tired of standing in this rain?" Virgil nodded and unlocked the passenger door. Clayton Reeve climbed into the truck's cab, bringing with him the smell of rain and ozone, and began to tell a story that would explain everything Virgil had witnessed and make him wish he'd never stopped at this particular rest stop on this particular night. Clayton Reeve settled into the passenger seat of Virgil's truck and pulled off his rain-soaked campaign hat, setting it carefully on the dashboard. His face was weathered in the way of men who'd spent years working outdoors, lines etched deep around his eyes and mouth that spoke of long hours squinting into harsh sunlight or driving rain. He looked to be in his mid-40s, old enough to have accumulated experience but young enough to still have the energy that the job demanded. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat, measured tones of someone who'd learned to deliver difficult information without emotional inflection. "What I'm about to tell you stays between us," Clayton began, his eyes fixed on the storm-lashed parking area beyond the windshield. "Not because it's classified or anything like that, but because talking about it officially opens doors that the department would rather keep closed. We have procedures for handling unusual incidents, and those procedures. I was doing a welfare check, making sure everyone was okay, when the phenomena started. Figures appearing and disappearing in the lightning flashes, vehicles that shouldn't have been there, the whole disturbing show. Most of the travelers thought they were just seeing things, blamed it on the storm's light effects or their own fatigue. But one woman, an elderly lady from Nebraska, she recognized what we were seeing, said her late husband had been a paramedic, and the uniforms and equipment she was seeing matched what he'd used back in the 90s. She wasn't scared, just sad. Said it looked like the responders were still trying to save people, still working the accident even though it had been years since it happened. "And the third time?" Virgil prompted when Clayton fell silent. "The third time was personal," Clayton said, his voice tight with emotion he was clearly trying to suppress. "My brother, Homer Dillard, works maintenance for the Kansas Department of Transportation. Different last name because we had different fathers, but we grew up together, been close our whole lives. About 2 years ago, he was assigned to this rest stop for his overnight shift. Cleaning restrooms, emptying trash, making sure everything was secure and functional. It was during storm season, May or June, and there was severe weather in the forecast. I tried to call him, warn him that he might experience something unusual if the conditions were right, but I couldn't get through. Cell service is terrible out here even on good days, and during storms it's non-existent." Clayton's hands clenched into fists, then slowly relaxed. "I came out here around 2 in the morning, after the worst of the storm had passed, to check on him. Found his maintenance van parked by the building, all the lights on, but no sign of Homer. I searched everywhere, calling his name, getting more worried with every minute. Finally found him sitting inside one of the restroom stalls, door locked, completely unresponsive. Took me 20 minutes to talk him into opening the door, and when he finally did, I barely recognized him. He'd aged years in a single night. His hair had gone gray at the temples, his face was drawn and haggard, and his eyes had this haunted quality like he'd seen things no person should see. What happened to him? He told me he'd been working, going about his normal duties, when the phenomena started. But instead of just seeing residual images, he said he experienced the entire accident, not watching it like an observer, but living through it as if he were one of the victims. He described feeling the impact, the crushing metal, the inability to breathe as the vehicle around him collapsed. He experienced dying multiple times, each death corresponding to one of the people killed in the accident. By the time the phenomena ended and he regained awareness of his actual surroundings, hours had passed and he was physically and psychologically traumatized in ways that no amount of therapy has been able to fully address. Virgil felt his stomach turn. Jesus Christ, that's horrific. Homer doesn't work overnight shifts anymore, Clayton continued. Doesn't work at rest stops at all, actually. The department transferred him to daytime highway maintenance, and he's doing better now. But he's never been the same. Says he still has nightmares about the accident. Still sometimes wakes up convinced he's trapped in twisted metal. Suffocating. And he absolutely refuses to drive on I-70 during storms. Says he can feel something about this stretch of highway, something wrong that goes deeper than just residual energy or temporal anomalies. The thunder rolled overhead, and Virgil watched the lightning paint the parking area in stark relief. The rest stop looked normal now, just a weathered building and empty pavement, nothing to suggest the disturbing history Clayton had described. But knowing what had happened here, knowing what could happen under the right conditions, transformed the entire place in Virgil's perception. It wasn't just a rest stop anymore. It was a scar on the landscape, a place where tragedy had left permanent marks that occasionally became visible to the living. "Why are you telling me all this?" Virgil asked. "You said the department doesn't like to discuss these phenomena officially. Seems like sharing this information with civilians would be against policy." "Because you experienced it," Clayton said simply. "You saw the figures, saw the vehicles appearing and disappearing. And from your expression when I approached your truck, I could tell you were rattled. I've seen that look before, on the faces of other travelers who've witnessed the phenomena. And I know what happens next if someone doesn't give them context for what they experienced. They start questioning their sanity, wondering if they're having a breakdown or if something's wrong with them. Some develop anxiety about driving, about storms, about rest stops in general. I've seen people abandon entire careers because of one unexplained encounter at this place, convinced they can't trust their own perceptions anymore." Clayton met Virgil's eyes with an intensity that demanded attention. "So I tell them the truth, or at least as much truth as I understand. I explain that what they saw was real in some sense, that they're not crazy or having hallucinations, but that what they experienced was residual phenomena from a past tragedy. And I tell them that the best thing they can do is accept what happened, understand that they witnessed something unusual but not dangerous, and then move on with their lives. Don't dwell on it. Don't let it take root in your mind and grow into something larger than it is." "Does that work?" Virgil asked. "Does giving people that explanation actually help them?" "Sometimes," Clayton admitted. "Not always. Some people can't let it go, can't accept that they experience something that doesn't fit into their understanding of reality. Those folks usually end up like my brother, traumatized in ways that therapy and medication can't fully address. But most people, if you give them a framework for understanding what happened, they can process it and move forward. They might avoid this particular rest stop in the future, might be a little more cautious during severe weather, but they don't let it destroy their ability to function." Virgil considered this, turning over Clayton's words in his mind. He'd experienced something disturbing, something that had shaken his confidence in his own perceptions. But now that he had an explanation, however strange and supernatural it might be, the experience seemed less threatening. It was still unsettling, still pushed against the boundaries of what he believed possible, but it no longer felt like evidence that he was losing his mind or experiencing some kind of psychological breakdown. "I appreciate you sharing this," Virgil said. "I'm not sure I believe in ghosts or whatever you want to call what's happening here, but knowing there's a history, knowing other people have seen similar things, that helps. Makes it feel less like I'm going crazy." "You're not going crazy," Clayton assured him. "You're just a guy who stopped at the wrong rest stop during the wrong weather. Bad luck, nothing more. Once this storm passes and you get back on the highway, you can put this whole experience behind you. Chalk it up to one of those strange things that happen sometimes on the road. File it away with all the other stories truckers tell each other, and get on with your life." As if responding to Clayton's words, the storm began to show signs of abating. The lightning flashes came less frequently, the thunder grew more distant, and the rain decreased from torrential downpour to merely heavy. The worst had passed, leaving behind the kind of eerie calm that always followed the severe weather, a stillness that felt almost unnatural after the fury of the preceding hours. "Looks like you'll be able to get back on the road soon," Clayton observed. "Storm's moving east, should be clear enough to drive safely within the next 30 minutes or so. You'll still want to watch for debris and standing water, but the dangerous conditions are past." "What about you?" Virgil asked. "You heading back out on patrol?" "In a bit. Want to make sure you get out of here okay, and I need to check the highway for any accident scenes or stranded motorists. Storms like this one always leave a mess to clean up." Clayton reached for his campaign hat and settled it back on his head, preparing to return to the rain. One more thing before I go. If you experience any more phenomena while you're sitting here waiting for conditions to improve, don't investigate. Don't approach the figures if you see them. Don't try to interact with the residual vehicles. Just stay in your truck, keep your doors locked, and wait it out. The phenomena can't hurt you physically, but they can be psychologically disturbing if you engage with them too directly. Best to just observe from a distance and remind yourself that what you're seeing happened in the past, not the present. Understood, Virgil said. And Clayton, thanks for being honest about all this, for giving me context. I know it probably goes against your training to discuss this stuff. Sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules, Clayton replied. He opened the passenger door and climbed down from the truck, pulling his rain slicker tight against the continuing drizzle. Safe travels, Virgil, and maybe next time you're driving through Kansas during storm season, plan your stops a little more carefully. Virgil watched the highway patrol officer walk back to his cruiser, climb in, and start the engine. Clayton sat there for a few minutes, apparently checking his computer or radio, then pulled out of the rest stop and headed back up the access road toward the interstate. His taillights disappeared into the rain-obscured darkness, leaving Virgil alone once more in the parking area with only his truck and the building full of disturbing history for company. The storm continued its retreat, and Virgil used the time to check his load, verify that nothing had shifted during the drive through severe weather, and review his route for the remainder of the journey to Kansas City. He was behind schedule, but not critically so. If he got back on the road within the hour and made decent time through the night, he could still arrive within his delivery window. The penalty clauses wouldn't apply, his record would remain clean, and this entire incident would become just another story in his collection of strange experiences accumulated over 26 years of long-haul trucking. But as he sat in his cab, listening to the rain gradually diminish and watching the parking area for any sign of renewed phenomena, Virgil couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, not in the rest stop, but in himself. He'd encountered something that challenged his understanding of reality, something that suggested the world contained layers and complexities he'd never considered. And while Clayton's explanation had provided comfort and context, it had also opened doors in Virgil's mind that could never quite be closed again. The rest stop was just a place where tragedy had left scars, Clayton had said. But what did it mean that those scars could bleed through time, could manifest in ways that living people could perceive? What did it say about the nature of reality that past events could somehow imprint themselves so deeply that they replayed under the right conditions? And if this rest stop carried such marks, how many other places in the world bore similar scars, waiting for the right circumstances to reveal what they remembered? These were questions Virgil didn't have answers for, questions he wasn't sure anyone had answers for. But they would stay with him for the remainder of his drive, and for days and weeks afterward, nagging at the edges of his consciousness and making him wonder what else might be waiting out there on the highways and byways of America, hidden in plain sight until circumstances aligned to reveal the truth. The rain stopped completely around 9:45 p.m., and Virgil decided it was time to continue his journey. He started his engine, checked his mirrors, and prepared to navigate back to the interstate. As he pulled out of his parking space and began the turn toward the exit, he noticed something that made him pause. In his rearview mirror, illuminated by his truck's taillights, figures were standing near the building. 4 or 5 of them, wearing emergency responder uniforms, watching his departure with that same assessing gaze he'd noticed earlier. They stood perfectly still, making no move to approach or communicate, just bearing witness to his leaving. And as Virgil watched, they began to fade, becoming transparent and then vanishing entirely, as if they'd been made of nothing more substantial than morning mist dissolving in sunlight. Virgil didn't stop, didn't slow down or try to get a better look. He just kept driving up the access road and back onto Interstate 70, leaving the rest stop and its residual phenomena behind him. But he knew, with a certainty that went deeper than rational thought, that what he'd witnessed tonight would never fully leave him. It would stay with him, a permanent reminder that the world was stranger and more complex than most people acknowledged, and that sometimes the past refused to stay buried, no matter how many years might pass. Virgil Tatum made his delivery to Kansas City without further incident, arriving at the warehouse facility at 6:32 a.m., well within his contracted window despite the storm delay. The receiving crew unloaded his cargo efficiently, and by 8 o'clock he was on his way to pick up a return load, a shipment of agricultural equipment heading back to Topeka. The job was routine, the kind of back-and-forth hauling that paid the bills without requiring much mental engagement. But as Virgil navigated the familiar streets of Kansas City's industrial district, he found his thoughts returning again and again to the rest stop and what he'd experienced there. Clayton Reeves' explanation had provided context, but it hadn't fully settled Virgil's mind. The phenomena he'd witnessed, the figures in emergency responder uniforms, and the vehicles appearing and disappearing, those could be rationalized as residual energy or temporal anomalies, or whatever terminology made them seem less supernatural. But there had been something else at that rest stop, something Clayton hadn't mentioned or perhaps hadn't experienced himself. An intelligence behind the phenomena, a sense of purpose that went beyond simple replay of past events. Virgil had felt it most strongly when the figures approached his truck in the lightning flashes, that assessing gaze that suggested they were looking for something specific, measuring him against some criteria he didn't understand. Residual energy didn't look, didn't assess, didn't make decisions. It just replayed, mechanical and mindless. What Virgil had encountered felt different, felt directed in ways that troubled him more deeply than any ghost story could have. He tried calling his wife from the warehouse office while waiting for his return load to be prepared, needing to hear her voice and reconnect with the normal world after the strangeness of the previous night. But Sarah didn't answer, which wasn't unusual given that she worked day shifts at the hospital and probably had her phone silenced during rounds. He left a brief message saying he'd been delayed by weather, but was fine, and would be home in a couple of days, then hung up feeling oddly disconnected from his own life, as if the experience at the rest stop had created a barrier between him and everything familiar. The return trip to Topeka should have been straightforward, a simple matter of retracing his route along I-70 and making his delivery by early afternoon. But as Virgil approached the section of highway where the rest stop was located, he found himself slowing down, his hands tightening on the steering wheel, his attention focused with unnatural intensity on the upcoming exit. It was broad daylight, no storm in sight, just clear September sky and the flat Kansas prairie stretching away to distant horizons. There was no reason to feel anxious, no reason to experience the cold dread that was settling into his stomach as he drew closer to that particular stretch of road. He told himself he would drive past without stopping, without even looking at the rest stop entrance. There was no need to revisit the place, no reason to put himself through another encounter with whatever was waiting there. But as the exit sign appeared, advertising the rest area 2 miles ahead, Virgil found his turn signal activating seemingly of its own accord, his hands guiding the truck toward the off-ramp before his conscious mind had fully decided what he was doing. The access road looked entirely different in daylight. Where last night it had seemed to descend into ominous darkness, today it was just a gentle slope leading to a modest facility that served its functional purpose without drama or mystery. The parking area held 3 passenger vehicles and a small moving truck, normal travelers making normal stops during normal daylight hours. The building itself, painted in faded beige that Virgil definitely remembered from the previous night, showed its age in cracked concrete and weathered surfaces, but nothing about it suggested the disturbing phenomena he'd witnessed. Virgil pulled into a parking space and sat behind the wheel, engine idling, trying to understand what had compelled him to return. He wasn't one for morbid curiosity, didn't have any particular interest in the paranormal or supernatural. His life had been defined by practical concerns and concrete realities, loads to haul, schedules to meet, miles to cover. The metaphysical questions that kept some people awake at night had never much interested him. So why was he here, voluntarily returning to a place that had frightened him and challenged his understanding of reality? The answer came to him slowly, reluctantly, rising from depths of his mind that he usually kept carefully suppressed. He was here because something at the rest stop had recognized him, had looked at him with that assessing gaze and seen something that marked him as significant or necessary or relevant in ways he couldn't comprehend. The phenomena hadn't been random, they'd been purposeful. And Virgil needed to understand that purpose, needed to know why he'd been singled out for attention. He climbed down from his truck and walked towards the building, moving with the deliberate steps of someone approaching something they feared but couldn't avoid. The other travelers in the parking area paid him no attention, focused on their own needs and schedules. A young couple with 2 small children were organizing snacks at a picnic table. An elderly man was walking a small dog on a leash, an entirely normal scene that bore no resemblance to the nightmare theater he'd experienced 12 hours earlier. The restroom was equally unremarkable, clean enough by rest stop standards with the usual institutional fixtures and harsh fluorescent lighting. Virgil went through the motions of using the facilities, washing his hands, checking his appearance in the mirror above the sink. He looked tired, he thought, older than his 51 years. The lines around his eyes had deepened, and there was a tightness to his expression that hadn't been there before last night. Stress, probably, or the beginning of whatever psychological impact Clayton had warned him about. He was drying his hands when he noticed the janitor's closet door standing slightly ajar. Through the gap, he could see cleaning supplies and equipment. Nothing unusual or noteworthy. But something about that open door drew his attention, held it with an insistence that felt external rather than internal. He found himself walking toward the closet, his rational mind protesting even as his feet carried him forward, and pushing the door fully open. The closet was larger than he'd expected, extending back perhaps 8 feet and containing industrial shelving units loaded with supplies. But what arrested Virgil's attention was the back wall, or rather what was written on it. Names. Dozens of names, maybe hundreds, covering every available surface in a variety of handwriting styles and implemented materials. Some had been written in permanent marker, others scratched or carved into the concrete, still others applied with what looked like paint or even blood. Virgil stepped into the closet, his heart rate accelerating as he examined the names more closely. Next to each one was a date, and many included additional information. Truck driver, died at mile marker 247. Paramedic, died responding to I-70 accident. Passenger, vehicle 4. The dates ranged from the early 1970s all the way up to the present, creating a chronological record of tragedies that had occurred on this stretch of highway over the course of nearly 5 decades. At the center of the wall, occupying the most prominent position, were 13 names circled together and marked with a single date, September 14, 2001. These were the victims of the accident Clayton had described, the tragedy that had initiated the rest stop's phenomena. Virgil read each name carefully, memorizing them, feeling the weight of their loss in a way that went beyond abstract sympathy. These were real people who'd died real deaths, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt responsible for bearing witness to their memory. "You can see it, too." The voice came from directly behind him, and Virgil spun around so quickly he almost lost his balance. A man stood in the closet doorway, blocking the exit. He was perhaps 40 years old, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt that suggested he was a traveler rather than facility staff. His expression was neutral, neither friendly nor threatening, but his eyes held a quality Virgil recognized from the previous night: the assessing gaze, the look of someone measuring and evaluating. "See what?" Virgil asked, his voice steadier than he felt. "The names. Most people walk right past this closet without noticing anything unusual. Those who do look inside see cleaning supplies and nothing more. But some people, those who've been touched by the phenomena, they see what's really here, the memorial wall, the record of everyone this stretch of highway has claimed." Virgil glanced back at the names, then returned his attention to the man blocking his exit. "Who are you, and who wrote all these names?" "Homer Dillard," the man said, and Virgil felt recognition jolt through him. This was Clayton Reeves' brother, the maintenance worker who'd experienced the phenomena so intensely that it had traumatized him beyond repair. But he looked different than Virgil had imagined based on Clayton's description. Not broken or haunted, but focused with an intensity that bordered on obsession. "Your brother told me about you," Virgil said carefully. "About what happened to you at this rest stop during a storm." Homer nodded slowly. "Clayton means well, but he doesn't understand what really happened that night. He thinks I experienced some kind of psychological trauma, that I lived through the accident victims' deaths through some supernatural empathy. But it was more than that. They showed me everything. The entire history of this place, all the deaths and near-deaths and moments of terror that have soaked into the ground here. And they showed me why. Why what? Why this place exists the way it does. Why the phenomena manifest. Why certain people can see them and others can't." Homer stepped further into the closet, forcing Virgil to back up until he was pressed against the wall of names. "This rest stop sits on what my people, my mother's people, would call a thin place, a spot where the boundary between the living world and the world of the dead gets permeable. Native Americans knew about it long before highways were built. They avoided it, told stories about it, recognized it as sacred and dangerous in equal measure. Then why build a rest stop here? Because white folks don't believe in thin places," Homer said with a bitter smile. "They see flat prairie and good drainage and easy access to the highway, and they build their infrastructure without considering that maybe there are reasons nobody's built anything here before. And then, when bad things happen, when people die at rates that exceed statistical norms, they blame it on weather or road conditions or driver error. Never on the fundamental wrongness of the location itself." Virgil's mind was racing, trying to process what Homer was telling him while also calculating whether he needed to be worried about this man who was standing between him and the exit with an intensity that bordered on mania. "The names on the wall, did you write all of them?" "Most of them. Some were already here when I started, written by previous maintenance workers or travelers who'd experienced the phenomena and felt compelled to memorialize what they'd seen. But I've added to it over the years, researching accident reports and death records, documenting everyone whose life ended on this stretch of highway. It's important work. Someone needs to remember. Someone needs to bear witness. Clayton said you don't work here anymore, that you transferred to different duties after what happened." "Officially, I don't work here," Homer agreed. "But I come back. During storms, during the times when the phenomena are strongest. I come back because someone needs to be here, needs to help those who get caught in the replay. The residual energy, as Clayton calls it, it's not mindless. It's not just mechanical repetition. The dead are trapped here, reliving their final moments over and over, and they need help. They need someone who can see them, who can acknowledge their suffering, who can maybe help them find a way to move on." "Can they move on?" Virgil asked, genuinely curious despite his growing unease about Homer's mental state. Can anything be done to help them? Homer's expression shifted, and for a moment, Virgil saw genuine pain break through the obsessive focus. I don't know. I've tried everything I can think of. Prayer, ritual, simple acknowledgement. Sometimes it seems to help, seems to quiet the phenomena for a while, but they always come back. The accident was too traumatic, the deaths too sudden and violent. The energy has nowhere to go, so it just loops endlessly, waiting for something to change or someone to provide resolution. That's what they were looking for last night, Virgil said, understanding suddenly crystallizing. When they approached my truck, when they looked at me with that assessing gaze, they were trying to determine if I could help them, if I was someone who might be able to break the cycle. And can you? Homer asked, leaning forward with an eagerness that made Virgil uncomfortable. Can you see them clearly? Can you communicate with them? Not everyone who witnesses the phenomena has the sensitivity to actually interact with the dead. Most people just see shadows and movements, residual images that don't respond to living presence. But some people, those with the right gift or curse or whatever you want to call it, they can actually engage with what's here, can make contact in ways that might matter. I don't have any special gifts, Virgil protested. I'm just a truck driver who stopped at the wrong place during the wrong weather. I saw things that disturbed me, but that doesn't make me some kind of medium or psychic. Everyone says that at first, Homer replied. Everyone denies what they are until the evidence becomes overwhelming. But you came back, didn't you? Even though Clayton warned you to stay away, even though you had no practical reason to return, you came back. That's not coincidence. That's the thin place calling to you, recognizing that you might be able to do what others couldn't. Virgil wanted to deny it, wanted to insist that his return was just morbid curiosity or a need for closure. But Homer's words resonated with something deep inside him, touched on intuitions he'd been having for years, but had always dismissed as imagination or pattern recognition errors. Throughout his trucking career, he'd experienced odd moments, brief flashes of knowing things he shouldn't know, or sensing presence where none should exist. He'd always attributed these experiences to fatigue or coincidence, never considering that they might indicate some genuine sensitivity to things beyond normal perception. What do you want from me? Virgil asked, deciding that direct confrontation was better than continued evasion. Come back tonight, Homer said. There's another storm system moving through, should arrive around midnight. The conditions will be similar to what they were during the original accident. The phenomena will manifest strongly. If you're here, if you're willing to witness and engage with what appears, maybe you can help them. Maybe you can provide whatever closure or acknowledgement they need to finally move on from this place. And if I refuse, Homer's expression hardened, then they'll keep suffering, keep reliving their deaths over and over for however many more years or decades it takes until someone else with your sensitivity comes along. And you'll spend the rest of your life knowing you could have helped but chose not to. That kind of knowledge, that guilt, it has a way of eating at people. Take it from someone who knows. Virgil looked past Homer toward the exit, calculating whether he could push past the man if necessary. But Homer seemed to sense his intention and stepped aside, clearing the path. I'm not going to force you. This has to be your choice. But if you decide to come back, I'll be here, and I'll help you understand what needs to be done. How will you know if I return? You said you don't work here officially. I'll know, Homer said with quiet certainty. The thin place will tell me. It always does when someone important arrives. Virgil left the closet and walked quickly through the building, his mind churning with everything Homer had told him. The other travelers in the parking area were preparing to leave, packing up their children and pets, and continuing their journeys. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware of the disturbing conversation that had just taken place a few dozen feet away. Virgil envied them their ignorance, their ability to visit this rest stop and see only concrete and paint and institutional fixtures. He climbed into his truck and sat behind the wheel, hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline from his encounter with Homer began to fade. Every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to start his engine and leave, to complete his delivery to Topeka and never think about this rest stop again. Clayton had given him an explanation that allowed him to rationalize what he'd experienced. He should accept that explanation, file the entire incident away as a strange story to tell at truck stops, and move on with his life. But Homer's words had awakened something in Virgil, some recognition of responsibility or purpose that he couldn't simply ignore. If there really were trapped souls at this rest stop, people reliving their deaths endlessly, and if he really did possess some ability to help them, didn't he have an obligation to try? What kind of person would he be if he just walked away from suffering he could potentially alleviate? The question followed him as he drove to Topeka, made his delivery, and found a truck stop for the night. It followed him through a restless few hours of attempted sleep and a breakfast he barely tasted. And it was still following him as evening approached, and another line of thunderstorms began building on the western horizon, moving east toward the section of I-70 where the rest stop waited. Virgil checked the weather forecast on his phone and confirmed what he already suspected. Severe thunderstorms were predicted for the area around the rest stop, with conditions expected to peak around midnight. If Homer was right about the phenomena manifesting most strongly during similar weather, tonight would be a repetition of what Virgil had experienced 2 nights ago. Possibly worse, given that Homer seemed to be planning something specific, some attempt at intervention or communication that required Virgil's presence and participation. He could still refuse, could drive in the opposite direction, or stay at the truck stop and wait out the storms in safety. Nobody would blame him for avoiding a place that had already disturbed him deeply. Nobody except himself. And that, ultimately, was what decided him. Virgil had spent 51 years living what he'd always thought of as a good life, making practical choices and avoiding unnecessary risks. But he'd also spent those years feeling like something was missing, some sense of purpose or significance that eluded him despite his best efforts to find it. Maybe this was his purpose. Maybe helping trapped souls at a haunted rest stop was the thing he'd been searching for without knowing it. Or maybe he was just rationalizing a dangerous decision, putting himself at risk because a possibly unstable man had convinced him he had some special ability. There was no way to know for certain except to go back and see what happened when the storms arrived and the phenomena manifested again. So, as darkness fell and the first rumbles of thunder sounded in the distance, Virgil Tatum turned his truck toward I-70 and began driving back toward the rest stop that had already claimed so many lives. He had no idea what would happen when he arrived, no clear plan beyond being present and open to whatever the thin place might show him. But for the first time in years, possibly for the first time in his entire adult life, he felt like he was moving towards something that mattered rather than just away from everything he'd failed to be. The highway stretched ahead of him, white lines disappearing into darkness, and Virgil followed them toward whatever waited at the place where the dead refused to rest and the living were occasionally called to bear witness to their suffering. Virgil Tatum arrived at the rest stop at 11:17 p.m., 43 minutes before the weather service predicted the storm system would reach peak intensity over this section of I-70. The parking area was empty except for a single white utility van that Virgil recognized as Homer Dillard's vehicle, parked near the building in a position that suggested its owner had been waiting for some time. The sky overhead was heavy with clouds that occasionally flickered with internal lightning, casting the landscape in brief moments of ghostly illumination before plunging it back into darkness. Virgil pulled his truck into the same spot he'd occupied 2 nights earlier and sat behind the wheel, second-guessing his decision to return. Everything about this situation screamed danger, warned him that he was involving himself in matters he didn't understand and couldn't control. But he'd come this far, had made the choice to be here. Turning back now would accomplish nothing except add cowardice to his growing list of regrets. Homer emerged from the building as Virgil climbed down from his truck, carrying what appeared to be a heavy duffel bag. In the sodium vapor light from the overhead fixtures, the maintenance worker looked both older and younger than he had during their daylight encounter, his face haggard with exhaustion, but his eyes bright with an enthusiasm that bordered on fanaticism. "You came," Homer said, and his voice carried relief mixed with vindication. "I wasn't certain you would." Most people, when confronted with this kind of responsibility, they find reasons to refuse it. "I'm not convinced I should be here," Virgil admitted. "But I couldn't stay away. Something about this place, about what you said, it won't let go of me." "That's the thin place recognizing you," Homer said. "Calling to you because you're one of the few who can hear it. Come inside. I need to show you some things before the storm arrives, need to prepare you for what's going to happen." Virgil followed Homer into the building, through the restroom area and into the janitor's closet where they'd spoken earlier. The memorial wall of names was exactly as Virgil remembered it, covering every available surface with its chronicle of tragedy. But Homer had added something since that afternoon. Candles, dozens of them, arranged on makeshift shelves in the floor, currently unlit but positioned with obvious care and intention. "What are these for?" Virgil asked. "Light," Homer said simply. "The phenomena exist in darkness, thrive in it. But light, real light from actual flame rather than electricity, it helps create boundaries, helps the dead understand where they are in relation to the living. During the manifestation, when the past and present start bleeding together, these candles will serve as anchors. They'll help you maintain your awareness of which reality you're in, help prevent what happened to me from happening to you." Homer began pulling items from his duffel bag, laying them out with the precision of someone performing a familiar ritual. A compass, showing magnetic north despite being inside a building, a digital voice recorder, a camera with what looked like specialized filters, a notebook filled with handwriting that Virgil couldn't read from his position but which appeared to be detailed observations or instructions. And finally, something that made Virgil's stomach tighten with apprehension. A laminated card bearing the names and photographs of the 13 people who'd died in the 2001 accident. "You're going to call to them," Virgil said, understanding Homer's intention. "You're going to deliberately invoke the phenomena instead of just witnessing it." "They're already here," Homer corrected. "Already trapped in their moment of death, replaying it endlessly. What I'm doing is creating conditions where communication might be possible, where they might be able to perceive us as something other than background elements in their eternal loop. The storm will provide the energy, the atmospheric conditions that make manifestation possible. The candles and other tools will help create structure, help channel that energy in productive directions. And you, if you really do have the sensitivity I think you have, you'll serve as the bridge between their reality and ours." "And what exactly am I supposed to do? How do I bridge realities?" Homer met his eyes with an intensity that suggested he'd been waiting years to share this information with someone who might actually understand it. "You listen. You witness, you acknowledge. The dead who are trapped here, they're frozen in their final moments, unable to move forward because their deaths were so sudden and traumatic that they never processed what happened to them. They need someone who can perceive them clearly, someone who can tell them what they already know but can't accept, that they're dead, that their moment has passed, that it's time to let go and move on to whatever comes next. You're asking me to tell ghosts they're dead," Virgil said flatly. That's what this comes down to. In the simplest terms, yes. But it's more complicated than that. You're not just delivering information. You're providing acknowledgement, bearing witness to their suffering, giving them permission to stop reliving their deaths and accept that those deaths have already happened. For people who died violently, who died without warning or preparation, that acknowledgement can be the key to release. Thunder rumbled overhead, closer now, and the first drops of rain began to patter against the building's roof. The storm was arriving on schedule, bringing with it conditions that would, if Homer was right, create a window of communication between the living and the dead. Virgil felt his heart rate accelerating, adrenaline beginning to flow through his system in preparation for whatever was about to happen. "And if this doesn't work?" Virgil asked. "If I can't communicate with them, or if they can't hear me, or if they simply refuse to move on, what then?" "Then we've tried," Homer said. "Then we've done what we could, and at least they'll know someone cares enough to make the attempt. That alone might help, might provide some measure of comfort even if it doesn't break the cycle completely." Homer began lighting the candles, starting with those closest to the memorial wall and working outward. As each flame sprang to life, the closet transformed, shadows shifting and dancing across the names in ways that made them seem almost alive, almost writhing. By the time Homer had lit the last candle, the space had taken on a quality that Virgil could only describe as liminal, existing somewhere between the mundane world of cleaning supplies and institutional fixtures and something else entirely, something that operated according to different rules. The storm intensified rapidly, going from light rain to torrential downpour in a matter of minutes. Lightning began striking with increasing frequency, and the thunder followed so closely that the building shook with each blast. The overhead lights flickered, dimmed, and then failed completely, leaving only the candles to illuminate the closet and the immediate surrounding area. In that dancing firelight, Virgil thought he saw movement in the main restroom area, shadows that weren't cast by anything visible, shapes that suggested human form without quite resolving into definite figures. "It's starting," Homer whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm's fury. "The phenomena are manifesting. Do you see them?" Virgil did see them, though see wasn't quite the right word for the experience. He perceived them, sensed their presence through a faculty that went beyond normal vision. There were people in the restroom, multiple people, moving with that same odd, shuffling gait he'd observed during his first visit. But these weren't the emergency responders in uniforms. These were civilians, ordinary travelers wearing the kind of clothing that had been fashionable in the early 2000s. They moved with jerky, discontinuous motion, appearing in one position and then suddenly in another without seeming to cross the intervening space. "They're the victims," Homer said, following Virgil's gaze. "The 13 who died in the accident. They're reliving the moments before impact, going through their normal routines without knowing what's about to happen to them. Watch. In a moment, they'll react to something, some warning sign or realization. That's when the awareness hits them, when they understand they're in danger." As Homer predicted, the figures suddenly changed their behavior. Their movements became frantic, purposeful, suggesting people reacting to emergency. Some appeared to be trying to help others, reaching out with hands that passed through the objects they were trying to grasp. Some seemed to be calling out, their mouths open in shouts that produced no sound Virgil could hear. And all of them, every single one, radiated a terror and confusion so intense that Virgil felt it like a physical pressure against his chest. "Now," Homer said urgently, "while they're in this state, while they're aware something is wrong but haven't yet experienced the impact, this is when they might be able to perceive us, might be receptive to communication. Use the card, read their names. Let them know they're seen. They're remembered. Virgil took the laminated card with hands that trembled slightly and began reading the names aloud, his voice competing with the storm's roar. Michael Preston, Jennifer Holloway, David and Marie Costner, Thomas Vega. With each name, he felt something shift in the atmosphere of the closet, some subtle change in the quality of attention being paid to his presence. The figures in the restroom seemed to pause, their frantic movements stilling slightly as if they were listening to something distant but important. He continued through all 13 names, reading them carefully and clearly, giving each one the respect of individual acknowledgement. When he finished, the figures had stopped moving entirely, standing motionless in positions that suggested they were waiting for something, some signal or instruction that would tell them what to do next. "They hear you," Homer breathed. "They're aware of you. Now tell them what happened, what they need to understand." Virgil opened his mouth to speak, but before he could form words, the phenomena intensified with shocking suddenness. The figures began to solidify, becoming less like shadows and more like actual people, their features clearly visible in the candlelight. And with that increased solidity came something Virgil hadn't expected: sound. He could hear them now, hear their voices calling out questions and warnings and desperate pleas for help. The cacophony was overwhelming. 13 voices all speaking at once, creating a wall of sound that made coherent thought nearly impossible. "Focus," Homer shouted over the noise. "Choose one. Direct your communication to a single individual rather than trying to reach all of them at once." Virgil's eyes found a woman standing near the entrance to the restroom, perhaps 30 years old, wearing jeans and a sweater that had probably been in fashion 20 years ago. Her expression was one of absolute confusion, and she was looking directly at Virgil with eyes that held questions she couldn't articulate. He focused on her, blocking out the other voices, and spoke as clearly and calmly as he could manage. "Jennifer Holloway, can you hear me?" The woman's expression changed, focusing on him with sudden, sharp attention. "Yes," she said, and her voice carried across the distance with impossible clarity. "Yes, I can hear you. What's happening? There was an accident, and then I don't understand where I am, or how long I've been here, or why I can't find my husband." "You were in a vehicle collision," Virgil said, choosing his words carefully. "On Interstate 70 in Kansas, there was a storm, and a truck lost control, and multiple vehicles were involved. You were injured in the accident." "Injured," Jennifer repeated, and her hand moved to her chest in a gesture that suggested she was checking for wounds she couldn't feel. "But I don't remember being taken to a hospital. I don't remember anything after the impact, just being here, in this place, trying to figure out what happened. And the others, they keep telling me we need to help the injured, need to get assistance, but I can't make the phone work and nobody seems to hear me when I call for help." Virgil glanced at Homer, silently asking for guidance on how to proceed. The maintenance worker nodded encouragement, his expression suggesting that Virgil was doing exactly what needed to be done. Taking a breath, Virgil continued. "Jennifer, I need you to understand something important. The accident you were in, it happened a long time ago, 17 years ago. The date today is September 5th, 2018. "That's not possible," Jennifer said, but her voice carried uncertainty rather than conviction. "It's September 14th, 2001. I was driving home from visiting my sister in Denver. I'm supposed to be at work tomorrow. I can't have lost 17 years. "You didn't lose them," Virgil said gently. "The accident, the injuries you sustained, they were fatal. You died that night, Jennifer. You and 12 others. I'm sorry, but that's the truth you need to accept." Jennifer's form flickered, becoming less solid, as if Virgil's words had destabilized whatever energy allowed her to manifest. "Dead," she repeated. testing the word. But I'm here. I can think, can speak, can perceive. How can I be dead if I'm still aware? You're trapped, Homer interjected, stepping forward to stand beside Virgil. Caught in the moment of your death, replaying it over and over because you never processed what happened. The trauma was too sudden, too overwhelming. You've been stuck here for 17 years, reliving your final moments without understanding that they were final. The other figures in the restroom had drawn closer, forming a loose circle around Virgil and Homer. Their expressions mirrored Jennifer's confusion and growing comprehension. They were listening, processing, beginning to understand the truth of their situation, even if that truth was almost impossible to accept. "My husband," Jennifer said, her voice breaking with emotion. "James, did he?" Virgil checked the laminated card, scanning the names and descriptions. "James Holloway," he read. "Passenger, vehicle 7. Yes, Jennifer, he was with you. He died in the accident, too." Jennifer's form began to fade more rapidly, but before she disappeared completely, her expression transformed from confusion to something that might have been relief or acceptance, or simply exhaustion. 17 years, she whispered. 17 years of not understanding, of being lost and frightened and unable to move forward. "Can we go now? Can we finally leave this place?" "I think so," Virgil said, hoping desperately that he was right. "I think acknowledging what happened, accepting the truth of your death, that's what allows you to move on. You don't have to stay here anymore. You don't have to keep reliving that night." One by one, the other figures began to fade as well, their forms becoming translucent and then vanishing entirely. Some seemed to leave peacefully, their expressions showing relief or even joy. Others faded with expressions of continued confusion or fear, as if they still didn't fully understand or accept what was happening. Within minutes, the restroom was empty again, showing nothing but institutional fixtures and the candlelight shadows that danced across tile surfaces. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the closet, a profound stillness had settled. Virgil and Homer stood surrounded by candles and names, both of them breathing heavily as if they'd engaged in strenuous physical activity rather than witnessed the departure of trapped souls. The memorial wall looked different now, Virgil thought, as if the names written there had somehow become less urgent, less demanding of attention and acknowledgement. "Did it work?" Virgil asked, his voice hoarse. "Are they really gone, or will they come back when conditions are right again?" "I don't know," Homer admitted. "I've tried this before, attempted to communicate with them, but I've never gotten responses as clear as what we just witnessed. Your presence, your ability to see them and speak with them, that made the difference. Whether it's permanent or just temporary, whether they'll return or they've truly moved on, only time will tell." They waited in the closet for another hour, watching for any sign that the phenomena would resume. But the restroom remained empty, silent except for the storm's diminishing fury. Eventually, Homer began extinguishing the candles, working with the same methodical care he'd used to light them. As each flame died, the closet returned incrementally to its mundane function, becoming once again just a storage space for cleaning supplies rather than a threshold between worlds. "Thank you," Homer said as he packed up his equipment, "for coming back, for being willing to try. Whether it worked or not, you gave them something nobody else has been able to provide. You gave them acknowledgement, recognition, a moment of genuine communication. That matters, even if it doesn't break the cycle completely." "What happens now?" Virgil asked. "Do you keep coming back here, keep trying to help them if they return?" "I'll come back," Homer confirmed. "Not just for them, but for all the others. The memorial wall has hundreds of names, representing decades of tragedies on this stretch of highway. If there's even a chance that communication is possible, that some of those trapped souls can be helped to move on, then I have to keep trying. It's the only thing that gives my experience, the trauma I went through, any kind of meaning or purpose. They walked together back to the parking area, where Virgil's truck and Homer's van sat illuminated by the returning overhead lights. The storm had passed, leaving behind the clean smell of rain-washed air and a sky beginning to clear as the system moved east. It was after 2 in the morning, and Virgil knew he should find somewhere to sleep before getting back on the road. But he felt wide awake, energized by what he'd witnessed and participated in, his mind churning with questions about the nature of death and consciousness, and the thin places where the boundaries between worlds grew permeable. "Will I see you again?" Virgil asked as Homer prepared to leave. "Probably not," Homer replied. "Unless you find yourself back at this rest stop during a storm. But I want you to remember what happened here tonight. Remember that you have a gift, a sensitivity that allows you to perceive and communicate with things most people can't see. That gift comes with responsibility, but it also offers opportunities to help in ways few others can. Don't waste it by denying what you are." Homer climbed into his van and drove away, leaving Virgil alone in the parking area with only his truck and his thoughts for company. He sat behind the wheel for a long time, not starting the engine, just thinking about Jennifer Holloway and the 12 others who'd been trapped in their moment of death for 17 years. Thinking about how many other trapped souls might exist in thin places across the country, waiting for someone with the right sensitivity to help them understand what had happened and give them permission to move on. Virgil had always believed his life lacked purpose, that he was just a man driving trucks from one location to another without any larger significance or meaning. But what if Homer was right? What if the sensitivity he'd always dismissed as imagination or coincidence was actually something real, something that could be used to help people even after their deaths? The possibility was both terrifying and exhilarating, opening doors to purposes he'd never considered and responsibilities he'd never imagined. He started his engine and pulled out of the rest stop as dawn began to break over the Kansas prairie, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed impossibly beautiful after the night's darkness and storm. He had loads to haul and deliveries to make, the practical concerns of his profession that would continue regardless of what he'd experienced. But he knew he was different now, changed in ways that would take time to fully understand or integrate into his life. The highway stretched ahead of him, and as Virgil drove, he found himself paying attention to things he'd always ignored before. The way certain locations felt different than others, carrying weight or significance he couldn't rationally explain. The occasional flickers at the edge of his vision that might have been fatigue, or might have been something else. The sense that the world contained more layers than he'd ever acknowledged. That reality was far stranger and more complex than the practical materialism he'd always accepted. He didn't know if he'd ever return to that rest stop, didn't know if he wanted to develop the sensitivity Homer claimed he possessed. The experience had been profound, but also disturbing, pushing him into territory he'd never explored and raising questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. But he couldn't deny what he'd witnessed, couldn't pretend that Jennifer Holloway and the others hadn't been real in some sense, hadn't been genuinely trapped and suffering until someone acknowledged their plight. 3 weeks later, Virgil was hauling a load through Missouri when he passed a rest stop and felt that same sense of weight and significance he'd noticed at the Kansas location. He almost drove past without stopping, almost convinced himself it was just his imagination. But at the last moment, he took the exit and pulled into the parking area, and as he climbed down from his truck, he saw them. Shadows moving near the building with that distinctive, jerky, discontinuous motion. Figures that shouldn't have been visible in broad daylight but were visible to him, calling out with voices only he could hear. He stood there for a long moment, trying to decide what to do. He could climb back in his truck and leave, could pretend he hadn't seen anything and continue with his life as it had always been. Or he could approach those shadows, could try to communicate with whatever was trapped there, could accept the responsibility that came with his unusual sensitivity. The choice was his, and making it would determine not just what happened in the next few minutes, but what kind of person he would become. Virgil took a breath, squared his shoulders, and began walking toward the shadows. He didn't know what would happen, didn't have Homer's experience or equipment or understanding of thin places, but he had seen what acknowledgement could do, had witnessed the relief on Jennifer Holloway's face when someone finally told her the truth about her death. If he could provide that same relief to other trapped souls, if his sensitivity could be used to ease suffering that would otherwise continue indefinitely, didn't he have an obligation to try? The shadows grew more distinct as he approached, resolving into forms that suggested people frozen in moments of trauma or confusion. Virgil recognized the look in their eyes, the same bewildered terror he'd seen in the Kansas rest stop. They were lost, trapped in their final moments, waiting for someone who could see them to help them understand what had happened and give them permission to move on. "I see you," Virgil said quietly, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I acknowledge you. Tell me your names, and I'll help you understand." The shadows responded, their voices rising in a chorus of confusion and hope and desperate need for acknowledgement. Virgil listened, bearing witness to their stories, and began the work of helping them find release from the places where they'd been trapped. It was hard work, emotionally draining and psychologically challenging, but it was also important work, necessary work, the kind of a purpose he'd been searching for his entire life without knowing what form it would take. The highway stretched away to infinite horizons, and there were rest stops dotted along its length where tragedy had left scars and trapped souls waited for help. Virgil Tatum, 51-year-old truck driver from Kansas, had found his calling at last. Not in the loads he hauled or the miles he covered, but in the thin places where the dead lingered and the living could sometimes reach across the boundary between worlds to offer comfort and acknowledgement and release. He would continue driving his roads, continue hauling freight across America's highways. But now he drove with new purpose, watching for the signs of thin places and trapped souls, ready to stop and provide help when needed. It wasn't the life he'd imagined for himself, but it was the life he'd been given, and he would honor it by using his gift to ease suffering wherever he found it. The storms would come again, and the phenomena would manifest, and Virgil would be there to witness and acknowledge and help those who needed help. For as long as he drove these roads, for as long as his sensitivity remained strong enough to perceive what others couldn't see, he would serve as a bridge between the living and the dead, helping trapped souls find their way home at last. And sometimes, late at night when the highway was empty and the stars burned cold overhead, Virgil would think about Jennifer Holloway and the 17 years she'd spent trapped in her moment of death. He would remember the relief on her face when she finally understood what had happened and was given permission to move on. And he would know, with a certainty that went beyond rational thought, that what he'd done that night at the Kansas rest stop had mattered in ways few things ever did. The dead needed advocates, needed someone who could see them and speak for them and help them find release from the places where trauma had trapped them. Virgil had become that advocate, and though the work was difficult and often disturbing, it was also deeply meaningful. It gave purpose to a life that had felt increasingly empty, gave significance to abilities he'd always dismissed as imagination. The highway rolled on, leading through thin places and thick, through moments of horror and moments of grace, and Virgil Tatum drove through it all, watching and listening and helping where he could. A trucker who'd discovered that some of his most important deliveries had nothing to do with cargo or schedules or practical concerns. Sometimes the most important thing you could transport was acknowledgement. Recognition. The simple truth that someone had been seen and heard and remembered. The thin places were waiting, and Virgil would find them, because that was his purpose now, his calling, the thing that gave meaning to all the miles and all the years. He was the witness, the acknowledgement, the voice that spoke truth to those who'd been trapped in lies of perpetual repetition. And he would continue that work for as long as the highway stretched ahead and trapped souls needed help finding their way home.